Look at your calendar. Look now. That calendar hanging on the wall of your kitchen, that calendar on your phone app, that calendar that organizes your week, your appointments, your days off. Look at it and answer me one thing. Who decided how it would be? Who decided that the week would start on Sunday? Who decided that God's day would be the first and not the seventh? Who decided that billions of human beings, from Brazil to Japan, from Russia to Argentina, would get up on a certain day of the week with the diffuse feeling that on that day, it was necessary to go to church, it was necessary to stop, it was necessary to worship? You never thought about that, did you? No one thinks. And that is exactly what makes the story I am about to tell you so disturbing. Because there is an exact moment, an exact day, an exact signature, an exact man with a name and surname, when the spiritual rhythm of the West was altered forever. And the vast majority of people who call themselves Christians today, at this very moment as you listen to me, have no idea when, how, or by whose order this happened. And worse, when someone discovers, when someone dares to pull that thread, the story of that person usually ends badly. That's what happened to him. He was a young man just over 20 years old. He was born in Amsterdam, in the midst of a community of Jewish refugees, people who had fled the fires of Lisbon and Porto, carrying little more than whispered prayers in their pockets. He was thin, short, with very large brown eyes, pale skin from spending whole nights reading by the light of a single candle. He made a living polishing lenses, lenses for glasses, lenses for microscopes, lenses for telescopes. The same hands that left the glass perfectly smooth, with the patience of a monk, turned the yellowed pages of ancient manuscripts when the sun set. And it was on one of those silent nights, perhaps in the biting winter of Amsterdam, perhaps listening to the distant sound of church bells he no longer attended, that he found it. A date, a decree, a name, and the ground of the world opened beneath his feet. Because what that young Jew found, hidden among pages of ecclesiastical history that few eyes had dared to read, was the proof that the most sacred day of Christianity, Sunday, that Sunday, you know, that Sunday of Mass, of hymns, of bent knees, had not been chosen by Christ. It had not been chosen by the apostles. It had not come down from heaven on a stone tablet, nor burned in the bush. It had been chosen by an emperor, a Roman emperor. An emperor who, at the exact moment he signed that decree, was still minting coins with the image of the unconquered sun god on the reverse. The name of the emperor was Constantine. The date was March 7th of the year 321, and the name of the young Jew who discovered all this centuries later and had the unbelievable audacity to say it out loud, that name was Baruch Spinoza. And it was because of this discovery, among others equally dangerous, that he received on July 27th of 1656 the greatest excommunication ever pronounced in the history of the Jewish community of Amsterdam. A curse so heavy that when read in the synagogue, it made old men cry and children hide behind their mothers, a curse that expelled him from everything, from everyone, from his family, from his people, from his memory. A curse that demanded in every letter that his name be erased from under heaven, and yet he continued writing, even alone, even persecuted, even poor, even coughing the glass dust that entered his lungs day after day, and that would later kill him, still young at 44. He continued writing, and what he wrote reached us. It crossed 3.5 centuries. It went through inquisitions, revolutions, world wars, dictatorships that burned books in public squares. And it arrived here, it arrived now, it arrived in this video, at this moment in your ears. That's why I ask you one thing. Just one. Don't listen to me in a hurry. Don't listen to me while doing something else. What comes next is one of the densest, most dangerous, and most liberating journeys that a human thought has ever dared to undertake. A true story, reconstructed from documents, letters, council minutes, pages of philosophy that men died to preserve. If you feel deep down that there is something that has never been told to you correctly, if you suspect that the official version of things has cracks too big to be ignored, then this video was made for you. More than that, you were led to it. and not by chance. Turn off the lights. Put your phone on silent. Take a deep breath. Because now the camera of your imagination will retreat many centuries. It will leave Amsterdam in winter. It will cross time as one crosses a corridor of mirrors, and it will stop in front of a heavy wooden door with red ribbons hanging from the doorknob, inside a palace on the banks of the Tiber River. Behind that door there is a man sitting at a table. There is a candle burning. There is a scroll open. There is a quill freshly dipped in ink. And there is a decision about to be made. A decision that will change everything you think you know about your faith, without ever asking your permission. Amsterdam, winter of 1656. The snow fell gently on the sloping roofs of the city, covering the chimneys that spewed white smoke into the lead-colored sky. The narrow streets were almost deserted at that hour. Only one or another fishmonger still shouted his wares at the corners, but even his voice sounded muffled by the silent mantle of ice. The canals, frozen at the edges, reflected the pale light of the lanterns like broken mirrors. And on one of those streets, on what was called Houtgracht, in a small house with white walls and dark wooden windows, there was a single candle burning. On the second floor, in the back room. That's where he was. Baruch de Spinoza, son of Miguel de Spinoza, merchant of dried fruits, of Jewish Portuguese blood, a refugee from the fires of the Iberian Inquisition. He was 23 years old at the time. He was thin as a candle. He had very large brown eyes, too large for his small face, and a pallor that came from within, from long vigils, from involuntary fasts, from the silence in which he had been immersed for months. His hands were delicate, with long fingers stained by ink from the inkwell, and by the fine glass dust with which he earned a living polishing lenses during the day. But at night, when the other Jews in the community were already asleep, when even the last bell of the last Catholic church in the neighborhood had already rung 9 times, Baruch did something else. He read, and what he read that specific night, in that specific winter, would change his life forever. The table before him was small dark wood and covered with papers. They were not ordinary papers. They were handwritten copies of ancient documents, painstakingly obtained from a bookseller friend in Leiden, a man named Jan Riewerts, who, under the pretext of selling Lutheran Bibles, secretly provided the curious with the most dangerous texts in Europe. Treatises by Cicero, heretical biblical commentaries, minutes from councils, letters from Roman emperors translated from Latin to Dutch, Socinian pamphlets, writings of Giordano Bruno, that Italian monk burned alive in Rome 56 years earlier for claiming that the universe was infinite and that there were other worlds. Spinoza read everything, in Hebrew, in Aramaic, in Latin, in Portuguese, in Spanish, in Dutch. He read with that insatiable hunger of those who feel from a very early age that the official answers they received were never enough. That night, however, he was bent over a handwritten copy of a text called Vita Constantini, the Life of Constantine, written by Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea in the 4th century. It was a rare book, a book that circulated carefully among the scholars of Europe, but that few read to the end because it was long, dense, and written in difficult ecclesiastical Greek. Spinoza read in Latin, and he read slowly. Each word felt like a nail being driven into a coffin. The candle flickered over the paper. Outside, the west wind whistled through the cracks in the window. It was then that he found it. It was an apparently unimportant passage, a paragraph among many others, in which Eusebius described, with his usual flattering tone, one of the supposed reforms of his beloved emperor. Constantine, the great Constantine, the one who, according to Christian tradition, had seen a cross in the sky before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, the one who had made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, the one who was venerated as a saint by the Eastern Church. This Constantine, Eusebius said, had decreed that all citizens of the empire, in all cities, in all provinces, should rest on a specific day of the week. And the name of that day, in the original Latin, was there, inscribed in the copy Spinoza held with trembling hands, Dies Solis, the day of the sun. Spinoza gently placed the scroll back on the table. He took off the thin, round glasses he had polished himself and rubbed his tired eyes. For a moment, he thought he had read it wrong. He brought the candle closer. He reread. He reread again. He reread a fourth time. And a fifth. Homines judices urbanaeque plebes et cunctarum artium officia venerabili dies solis quiescant. That all judges, and the inhabitants of the cities, and all the offices of the various professions, rest on the venerable day of the sun. It was the decree, the original decree, dated March 7th of the year 321 of the Christian era, signed by an emperor who, at that same time, was still minting coins with the image of the unconquered sun god on the reverse, an emperor who had not yet been baptized, an emperor who would continue to publicly worship the sun as a personal deity for many years after that signature. A pagan emperor, in other words, decreeing to the Christian world that the holy day of faith in Christ would be the day of the Roman solar god. Spinoza felt his chest tighten. He stood up. He walked to the window. He opened a crack. The cold air hit his face. Outside, the snow continued to fall, indifferent. The canals shone under the moon. And somewhere in that sleeping city, in some temple, under some golden cross, someone was preparing the sermon for the next day. Sunday, the Lord's Day, Holy Day, the day when all of Christendom in Europe, from Rome to Stockholm, from Paris to Moscow, from Lisbon to Krakow, would kneel. But in the name of what? That was the question now hammering in the head of the young lens polisher. In the name of what? In the name of Christ. Which Christ? Christ had been Jewish. He had kept the Sabbath. He had taught in the synagogues on the Sabbath. He had been buried before the Sabbath and resurrected after, yes, but at no point in the 4 canonical Gospels, Spinoza knew them by heart, in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, at no point was there a single line saying, "Change the day. Worship me on the first day of the week. Abandon the Sabbath." There was none. Spinoza had searched. He had searched for months. There was none. And yet, all of Europe was doing exactly that. He returned to the table. He sat down. He picked up another notebook, a blank notebook, bound in dark leather, and dipped the quill in the inkwell. He began to write. He wrote that night for hours. He noted the quote in Latin. He noted the translation. He noted cross-references with other texts from the same period. He noted names of bishops, councils, cities. He noted hypotheses. He noted questions. He noted above all questions, because it was in the methodical crafting of dangerous questions that Baruch Spinoza was learning to turn his mind into a blade. When the rooster crowed for the first time, around 4:30 in the morning, he was still writing. The candle had burned almost to the end. His fingers ached, his eyes burned. But he had something now that he hadn't had before. He had the beginning of a thread, a thin thread but strong, that if pulled carefully over the years, perhaps decades, could unravel an entire tapestry of spiritual lies that had covered Europe for over 1,300 years. He blew out the candle. He lay down dressed on the narrow cot, but he did not sleep. He looked at the low ceiling of the room with its wooden beams darkened by time, and for a long, very long moment, he felt fear. True fear. The kind of fear that does not come from concrete threats, but from the sudden intuition that the path just discovered is a path from which one can no longer return, because he was Jewish, the son of a small, closed community, traumatized by centuries of persecution. The Jews of Amsterdam were tolerated by the Dutch Protestants, yes, but tolerated on a very thin thread, under the strict condition of not causing scandal, of not attracting the attention of Christian authorities, of not provoking either the hatred of the still warring Spanish Catholics or the suspicion of the local Calvinists. And what Baruch Spinoza was beginning to investigate that night was not just a historical flaw, it was a bomb. A bomb that, if detonated, would strike at the central pillars of institutional European Christianity, Catholic and Protestant alike. He knew that. And he also knew something else, more intimate, more painful. He knew that even within his own community, no one would understand. The rabbis of Amsterdam were not revolutionaries. They were tired men, traumatized, marked by the fire of the Portuguese Inquisition, who only wanted to survive, marry off their children, bury their parents, and read the Torah in peace. For those men, Any Jew who dared to poke the theological hornet's nest of Christianity would be seen as a mortal threat to the entire community. He would be seen as someone who could provoke widespread retaliation. He would be seen as a public danger. Spinoza knew that sooner or later they would come after him. He knew he would be called, interrogated, pressured, perhaps bribed, and that, when all those attempts failed, he would be cursed. And yet, on that cold winter morning, under the low ceiling of his poor room, with the first grey light of dawn gently hitting the window panes, he made the decision. He would continue, no matter the cost, because there was, in that ancient decree of a dead emperor over 13 centuries ago, a door that was closed to the world, but that was now opening exclusively for him. And behind that door, he sensed, was something great, something enormous, something capable of changing not only his life, but the way future generations would think about God, about faith, about freedom, about the very meaning of the word truth. The first bird of the day sang on the neighbor's roof. Baruch Spinoza closed his eyes, not to sleep, to begin to think. And it was thus, in silence, without anyone in all of Europe knowing, that one of the most dangerous intellectual adventures in the history of humanity began. The days that followed that discovery were not Spinoza's days. They were the days of the decree. The decree had entered him like a wooden stake enters soft earth, and from that night on everything he did, polishing lenses in the workshop, eating the thin soup served by his aunt, walking to the synagogue, nodding to the neighbors, listening to the Saturday sermon delivered by the chief rabbi. Everything was pierced by that single Latin phrase that he could now recite with his eyes closed, Venerabili die solis quiescant, rest on the venerable day of the sun. But Spinoza, and this is perhaps what characterized him most since he was young, was not a man to jump to conclusions. He had inherited from the old Sephardic rabbis a rare virtue, intellectual patience. That patience that knows that a single citation proves nothing, that a single piece of evidence, no matter how shocking it seems at first glance, can have dozens of alternative explanations, and that the honest thinker is precisely the one who obliges himself, before any conclusion, to seek all contrary evidence with the same intensity with which he sought the favorable ones. That's what he did. In the following weeks, he returned to the bookseller Reuvert's and asked for more texts. He asked for copies of the Codex Theodosianus, the great compendium of late Roman laws. He asked for works by Socrates Scholasticus and Sozomen, two ecclesiastical historians who had written a few decades after Constantine. He asked for fragments of Philostorgius. He asked for excerpts from the Council of Laodicea. He even asked for extremely rare copies of letters from 4th century bishops that had survived in Greek monasteries. Reuverts, who was no fool, looked at Spinoza over his glasses and simply asked, "Do you know what you are looking for, young friend?" Spinoza took a moment to respond. Then he said in a low voice, "I am looking for the exact moment when faith ceased to be faith and became politics." The bookseller held back a laugh. He was a tolerant man, a secret sympathizer of the Socinians, the Arminians, the heretics in general, and he had no fear of Spinoza. On the contrary, he felt a silent admiration for that thin young Jew, as if he recognized in him a spirit whose flame, if it survived the winds, would burn very high. He handed him the texts without asking further questions. He only warned at the moment of farewell, "Be careful who you talk to, Baruch. In Amsterdam there are many eyes, and not all eyes love what they see." Spinoza thanked him with a small gesture and left carrying under his arm the papers that would change the course of his existence. For months he read. He read as one digs. He read as one listens attentively to the sound of their own heartbeat, waiting for the moment when an irregularity in the rhythm will reveal a previously hidden illness. And little by little, the picture began to take shape. The pieces began to fit together. He discovered first that the decree of March 7th of 321 was not an isolated case. It was the first stone of a larger building. Constantine had, over the following years, issued other edicts reinforcing the obligation of the dies solis. In 323, in 325, in 329, each time expanding the rule, closing exceptions, standardizing observance in all provinces of the empire, from North Africa to Britain, from Egypt to Hispania. He discovered, secondly, that the bishops of the time had not protested. They had not risen up. They had not said, "Emperor, this is unacceptable. Our holy day is Saturday according to God's law." On the contrary, they had complied. And more than complied, they had reinforced. Local councils, especially that of Laodicea around the second half of the 4th century, had gone so far as to explicitly prohibit Christians from resting on Saturday under penalty of excommunication, declaring them Judaizers, a word that in that context was practically a social death sentence. He discovered, thirdly, that this transition had not been smooth. There was resistance. There were entire Christian communities, especially in Syria, Ethiopia, and parts of Persia, that continued to observe the Sabbath for centuries after Constantine's decree. Some of those communities were hunted down, dispersed, burned. Others survived in the mountains, in hidden valleys, in remote monasteries. But the general trend was unmistakable. The institutional Church of Rome, and later the Church of Byzantium, had embraced Sunday. And from the 5th century onward, the memory that one day, many years before, the first followers of Christ observed another day, was slowly, systematically, deliberately erased from popular catechisms. Spinoza took notes. He noted everything. His notes already filled 3 thick notebooks, and the more he noted, the more a strange feeling began to take hold of him. It was not just the intellectual feeling of discovering something new. It was a deeper feeling, a kind of moral vertigo, the feeling of someone who realizes that all of humanity has been deceived, not by a single glaring and obvious lie, but by a silent, technical maneuver executed by men in offices involving decrees, minutes, synods, translations, omissions, a maneuver so slow and so effective that, over the centuries, no one remembered that there had ever been any maneuver at all. It was on one of those nights, reading by the weak light of the candle, that Spinoza stopped. He set down the quill. He looked out the window. Outside, the sky of Amsterdam was clear. The stars shone brightly. It was one of those rare winter nights when the extreme cold leaves the air so dry that the firmament seems a black cloak embroidered with silver. And he thought, in a sudden access of melancholy, of all the people who at that moment were sleeping peacefully in their homes, in the absolute confidence that the following Sunday they would go to Mass to fulfill a divine commandment. He thought of the mothers who were teaching their small children, that very night, to pray before sleeping. He thought of the peasants far away in the fields of Poland, in the mountains of Spain, in the plains of France, who could not read either Latin or Greek, and who would never know that the day they stopped working to rest had been chosen by a man with a crown, and not by a voice from heaven. He thought of his own mother, who had died many years ago, and he thought of her face at the moment of death. And he thought, with a pain that hurt deeply, that perhaps what he was doing there at that table, by the light of that candle, was not just a philosophical exercise. It was an act of love for the people who never had the privilege of knowing, for the people who lived, suffered, died, and were buried, believing in things that no one ever had the delicacy to tell the truth about. It was at that moment that Spinoza decided, definitively, that he would write, that at the right moment, with the right patience and the right courage, he would expose all of it, not to humiliate the faith of others, not to destroy the religion of the simple, but to open a window, a single window, so that, in the future, anyone who wanted could look through. And here, my friend, my listener, I need to take a pause, because what we are experiencing in this video, now, together, is exactly that same gesture. It is the gesture of Spinoza crossing the centuries, knocking at your door. It is this window being opened for you. And I wanted to ask you one thing, straightforward, soul to soul. If you were Baruch Spinoza that night, with those papers on that table, knowing that writing the truth he discovered could cost him his family, his community, perhaps his very life, would you have written? Would you have had the courage? Or would you have closed the notebook, blown out the candle, and moved on pretending you had never seen? Think about it, feel it, and answer me in the comments. Don't answer quickly. Answer with your heart, because your answer will say more about you than about Spinoza. And while you think, let me tell you something. This channel was made for people like you. People who are not satisfied with the easy version. People who feel deep down that there is always another layer, a door behind the door, a truth behind the truth. If you have made it this far, if you are feeling what I am feeling as I tell you this story, then do one thing for me, for both of us. Click down below on the subscribe button. It costs nothing, and it makes all the difference because each subscription is one more candle on Spinoza's table. It is one more reader he did not have in life. It is a small gesture of yours in alliance with everything that, over the centuries, has been silenced and almost forgotten. Subscribe, comment, and come with me. Because now the story will retreat many centuries. It will leave Amsterdam, it will cross time as one crosses a deep river swimming, and it will stop in front of the marble palace of that man who, on a March morning, dipped the quill in the bronze inkwell and changed the calendar of the world. The emperor was about to make a decision, and no one, in any corner of the empire, would ask the right question. Except, 13 centuries later, a lens polisher in Amsterdam. To understand what Spinoza had discovered, we must go back. Go back a long way. Go back 13 centuries. Go back to the moment when it all began. And for that, we need to close our eyes. Forget for a moment Amsterdam. Forget the snow, forget the flickering candle over the scroll, and open our eyes in a very different city. In a city bathed in strong sunlight. In a city where the domes shone golden, where the markets buzzed with people, where the heavy smell of incense mingled with the sour smell of pagan offerings burned on public altars. Rome, the year 321. But not the Rome of the glorious legions of Caesar's time. Not the Rome of Augustus's splendor. It was a different Rome, a tired, divided Rome, crossed by crises, epidemics, and successive military coups. A Rome that had been, for almost half a century, a scene of almost permanent civil war, where ambitious generals emerged and disappeared with the speed of the seasons. A Rome where the imperial throne had changed hands so many times that the citizens themselves lost count of the names of their rulers. And in the midst of this, Rome was he, the man who would change everything. Constantine, son of a general named Constantius Chlorus and a humble woman named Helena, a woman whom many ancient accounts describe as the daughter of an innkeeper, perhaps a servant, perhaps a concubine, and whom the Church would later transform into a Saint Empress, mother of Christendom. Helena, that same Helena who, according to later tradition, would discover the nails of Christ's cross on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, although no serious historian, not even Eusebius, has ever been able to confirm the story. Constantine had come to power in the bloodiest way possible. He had defeated a brother-in-law, then another brother-in-law, then a co-emperor. He had fought the famous Battle of the Milvian Bridge in October of 312, and after it told a story that time would magnify to the point of turning it into the foundational myth of institutional Christianity, the story of the cross in the sky, the story of the inscription, in hoc signo vinces, in this sign you will conquer. But Spinoza, that winter in Amsterdam, had read the primary sources carefully. And he had noticed one very curious thing, something that practically no Sunday sermon ever mentions. The oldest versions of this story, written by contemporaries of Constantine, diverge from each other in absolutely irreconcilable ways. Lactantius, writing a few years after the event, speaks only of a dream on the night before the battle, without mentioning any vision in the sky during the day. Eusebius, writing decades later, is the one who inserts the famous daytime vision with the luminous cross and the inscription in Greek, and he himself confesses to having received the account from Constantine himself in a private conversation many years later, and swears that the emperor told him the story under oath. Other ancient historians, such as Zosimus, do not even mention the event, attributing Constantine's victory solely to military skill and the betrayal of enemy officials. In other words, the founding story of Constantine's conversion, the cornerstone upon which the Church built the myth of a God-chosen emperor, was itself a contested, contradictory, uncertain story. And yet over the centuries it became a kind of unquestionable truth, repeated in catechisms, painted in frescoes, sculpted in marble, engraved on coins. Spinoza noted this in his notebook. He noted even more. He noted that even after the supposed vision of 312, Constantine continued to behave in an astonishingly pagan manner during the following 12 years. He continued to mint coins with the image of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, the official solar deity of the Roman pantheon of that period. He continued to attend public pagan rituals. He continued to use the title of Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of the pagan religion, a title he never abandoned throughout his life. He continued to make public sacrifices. He continued to consult augurs. He continued to erect statues of himself with solar attributes, the crown of rays on his head, the whip of the charioteer, the globe in his hand. Constantine, in summary, was not a Christian. He was, at best, a syncretist, a man who worshipped the sun, and who considered Christ perhaps a manifestation or an aspect of that same sun. Later, Christian theologians tried, with enormous argumentative contortions, to explain these contradictions. They said he was Christian in heart, although pagan in form. They said he reserved baptism only for his deathbed, according to a custom of the time. They said. But the coins were there. The titles were there. The monuments were there. And they spoke for themselves. And it was this man, this ambiguous man, this mixed man, this man between two worlds, who signed, on the morning of March 7th of 321, the decree that would forever change the religious calendar of the West. The scene reconstructed by Spinoza, based on the chronicles he had read, was more or less like this. It was a cold morning, one of those Roman mornings at the beginning of spring, when the night chill still lingers, but the sun begins to warm the stones of the columns. The emperor was in his palace, perhaps on the Palatine, perhaps in his new residence under construction in Byzantium, perhaps in Sirmium. The documents are not unanimous about the exact location, but he was sitting at a low, carved wooden table with the scribes arranged in a semicircle before him. He wore a purple tunic, as was customary. He wore around his neck, according to iconographic records of the period, a double medallion. On one side, the monogram of Christ, the famous Chi-Rho that he had ordered to be painted on the shields of his troops, and on the other side the unmistakable image of Sol Invictus with the radiant head of 12 rays. The scribes waited. The pen was ready. The parchment was stretched. Constantine then dictated. The phrase he dictated was formulated with extraordinary rhetorical care, and Spinoza had lingered long over each word. The decree did not say, "the day of the Lord." It did not say, "the day of resurrection." It did not say, "the holy day of Christians." Wait, no. The decree said in all letters, in crystalline Latin, "Venerabili die solis," the venerable day of the sun. It was a deliberately ambiguous formula. It served, at the same time, the pagan sun worshippers, who would continue to understand the phrase in their own way as they always had, and the Christians, who, without anyone asking their permission, without anyone giving them an alternative, without anyone even consulting them, suddenly found themselves bound by imperial law to a day of the week that, until then, had not been their main holy day. It was a brilliant move, politically brilliant. With a single signature, Constantine managed, first, to please the powerful pagan elite of the empire, which still dominated the Senate and most provinces, and would never openly accept that the emperor renounced solar cults. Second, to please the growing Christian community, especially its Roman and Western wing, which had been developing a certain preference for the first day of the week since the mid-2nd century, partly as an anti-Jewish reaction, partly for liturgical reasons, partly by imitation of neighboring solar cults. And third, most importantly, to unify the rhythm of the empire, standardize rest, synchronize markets, synchronize legions, synchronize courts, create a common pulse for that gigantic and fragmented organism. It was pure social engineering. It was politics disguised as faith. And it was at that exact moment, that specific morning, with that specific pen dipped in that specific inkwell, that something invisible yet absolute moved in the history of humanity, without trumpets, without earthquakes, without prophets announcing. Just a man with a crown, a signature, a parchment, and the world's calendar turned. Spinoza, reading these sources in Amsterdam, 13 centuries later, felt the magnitude of the gesture, and he also felt acutely the tragic irony of that moment, because the Christians of the following generations, upon receiving this imperial novelty, instead of protesting, instead of invoking Scripture, instead of demanding the maintenance of Saturday according to the fourth commandment, embraced it. They embraced it enthusiastically. They built an entire justifying theology on that pagan decree. They invented symbolic explanations. They invented biblical typologies. They invented allegories. And, over the following centuries, they ended up completely forgetting that it all began as a political maneuver by a sun-worshipping emperor. It was this collective amnesia that fascinated Spinoza. How, he wondered, is it possible that hundreds of millions of human beings for 1,300 years did not realize? And he formulated in that notebook the first serious hypothesis of all his future philosophy, a hypothesis that he would later develop with terrible mathematical elegance in his ethics and in his theological political treatise. The hypothesis was this, that the masses left to themselves do not seek the truth, they seek comfort. And nothing is more comfortable than repeating what the entire community around them repeats. Habit is the most powerful of all forces, stronger than logic, stronger than evidence, stronger even than love for parents and children. That was why, Spinoza concluded, Constantine's decree had worked, not because it was true, but because, after a few generations, everyone had already gotten used to it. And custom, when it becomes generational, becomes sacred. And the sacred, when no one dares to question it anymore, becomes eternal law. But who was this man? Who was really this Constantine, who changed the world's calendar with a single signature? The official figure, the holy emperor, the defender of the faith, the father of the church, the one whose image appears in Byzantine mosaics with a golden halo and a pious gaze, Spinoza had already discarded in the first weeks of research. That Constantine was a later invention. It was hagiographic literature. It was propaganda. The real Constantine, the historical Constantine, the Constantine of primary documents, was a much more complicated, much darker, much more disturbing man. Spinoza began to piece together the portrait with the patience of a painter. Constantine was tall, robust, with a thick neck and broad shoulders. The surviving sculptures from the time show a man with hard features, a prominent chin, thin lips, a fixed, cold, calculating gaze. He was not an intellectual. He was not a philosopher. He was a soldier, son of a soldier, grandson of a soldier, raised in barracks on the borders of the Rhine and the Danube, accustomed since childhood to the smell of iron, the sound of horses, the silence of the fields after battles when the crows descend. He had, according to all sources, a sharp political intelligence, an intelligence that could read men, knew how to identify who was ambitious, who was vain, who could be bribed, who was dangerous, knew how to manipulate councils and armies with the same coldness, knew how to wait, and above all knew how to kill, because Constantine, and this part is rarely mentioned in Sunday sermons, was one of the bloodiest emperors of his lineage. He ordered the execution of Maximian, his own father-in-law. He ordered the execution of Bassianus, his sister's husband. He ordered the execution of Licinius, his brother-in-law and former co-emperor, after publicly swearing to spare him. He ordered the execution of Licinianus, his 9-year-old nephew, who had committed no crime other than being the son of whom he was. He ordered the execution of Crispus, his own eldest son, under circumstances never fully clarified, and he ordered the execution of Fausta, his second wife, supposedly suffocating her in the scalding steam of a closed bath. Spinoza, as he lined up this list of the dead in his notebook, paused. It was not the violence itself that shocked him. That was a violent time. Violent emperors were the rule, not the exception. What shocked him was the contrast between this blood-soaked family biography and the golden halo that centuries later the Eastern Church would place around that head, transforming the murderer of son and wife into a saint, an is-apostle, an equal to the apostles. And it was looking at this contrast that Spinoza began to understand something profound, something that he would later describe with his mathematical rigor in rigorous propositions. The thing was this: political power and religious power, when they touch, mutually deform each other. Neither sanctifies the other, as the apologists claim. Both contaminate each other. The saint lends his authority to the tyrant, and in return, the tyrant lends his armies to the saint. And at the end of the exchange, what remains is neither religion nor politics. It is something third, hybrid, monstrous. A new creature. An institution that has the brutality of the state and the presumption of infallibility of the church, and which is more dangerous than either one separately. Constantine, Spinoza discovered, had been the father of this creature. Before him there had been Christian persecution, yes. There had been martyrs, yes. The history of the first 3 centuries of the church was largely a story of Christians being thrown to lions, burned on pyres, beheaded in arenas. A tragic story, but spiritually coherent. The Christians were a persecuted minority, and like any persecuted minority, they remained pure, or more or less pure, by the simple impossibility of making alliances with power. There was no power to ally with them. They were despised, marginal, suspicious. Everything changed with Constantine. With Constantine, suddenly, being Christian ceased to be dangerous and became convenient. Bishops who had previously hidden began to have palaces. Clergy who had previously been ragged began to wear embroidered silk tunics. Synods that had previously been clandestine began to be convened by the emperor himself, paid with state money, transporting bishops via the cursus publicus, hosting them in official villas. The church, which had been persecuted for nearly 300 years, became one of the largest landowners in the empire in just a few decades, one of the largest employers, one of the largest financial institutions in the known world. And of course, this transformation came at a price. The price, Spinoza identified clearly in the ancient texts, was obedience. In exchange for privileges, the emerging church had to accept an unprecedented imperial interference in its internal affairs. It was Constantine who convened the Council of Nicaea in 325. It was Constantine who personally presided over the sessions. It was Constantine who defined, through his political influence, what would be the acceptable Trinitarian formula and what would be considered heresy. It was Constantine who ordered Arius to be exiled, and later ordered him to be rehabilitated, and later reversed that decision. It was Constantine who, in summary, transformed Christianity, which until then had been a decentralized, plural faith lived in autonomous local communities, into an imperial, centralized, hierarchical, top-down, standardized religion. And it was in that same movement, Spinoza observed, that the decree about the dies solis was inserted. It was not an isolated event. It was part of a much larger operation, an operation of imperializing the faith, of merging throne and altar, of fabricating what would later be called Caesaropapism, the unity between Caesar and the Pope, between state and religion. Spinoza, upon realizing this, felt a mixture of horror and technical admiration. Horror for the content, admiration for the ingenuity of the execution. Constantine had been brilliant, cold but brilliant. In just over 2 decades, he had managed to take a religion that had heroically resisted the state for 300 years and transformed it, from within, into an appendage of the state, without violence, without reverse persecution, just with well-distributed privileges, strategic appointments, carefully formulated decrees with patient and relentless diplomacy. And the result of this political operation, the Christian Sunday, the Christian calendar, the imperial standardized mass, the politically subordinated bishops, this result lasted now, that winter of 1656, for 13 centuries. 13 centuries. More than 40 human generations had lived and died within that edifice without ever questioning it. And Spinoza, sitting at the small table under the candlelight, thought, how many people, over those 13 centuries, must have had the same intuition as I? How many must have begun to ask the same questions? And what happened to them? He already knew the answer. Some had been burned alive, others hanged, others exiled, others simply erased with their books burned, their names crossed off the lists, their memories dissolved in widespread forgetfulness. He remembered names he had read in his studies. Vigilantius of Aquitaine, in the 4th century, denounced abuses of the imperial church and was silenced. Claudius of Turin in the 9th century contested the cult of images and died marginalized. Berengar of Tours in the 11th contested transubstantiation and was forced to publicly abjure under threat of death. Wycliffe in 14th century England translated the Bible for the people and was posthumously condemned as a heretic, with his bones exhumed and burned by order of the Council of Constance. Hus in Bohemia went to the stake in 1415, Giordano Bruno in Rome in 1600. Galileo in 1633, just 23 years before that night, had been forced to kneel before the Inquisition tribunal and publicly renounce what he knew to be true. Each of those names was a warning, a personal warning addressed, through the centuries, to the young Jewish lens polisher who was now rereading them. Be careful, Baruch, look what happened to us. And yet, even while reading those warnings, even knowing each of those terrible stories, Spinoza did not back down. On the contrary, each name read only reinforced his conviction. Those men had died, but their questions remained alive. Questions do not die with the man. They leap, transmigrate, find other lips, other pens, other generations. And as long as there is somewhere in the world a single human being willing to ask the right questions, their work will not have been in vain. Spinoza decided to be that human being. It was then, perhaps that night, perhaps on another very close one, that he began to mentally outline the book that would later be called the Theological Political Treatise. A book that, when published anonymously in 1670, 13 years after that winter, would be immediately banned throughout Christian Europe, by Catholics, by Calvinists, by Lutherans, by both simultaneously, a book that the philosopher Pierre Bayle would later call, years later, the most dangerous book ever written, a book that would be burned in public squares in The Hague, in Amsterdam, in Hamburg, in Leipzig. But Spinoza, that winter, did not know this. He only knew that he had an ancient decree in his hands. He knew he had a notebook full of notes. He knew he was 23 years old, and he knew that from then on, his life would be difficult, more difficult than he imagined. But Spinoza knew that just the decree of Constantine would not be enough, no matter how scandalous that document was, and it was. The institutional church, over the centuries, had developed elegant responses to anyone who tried to use it against her. The theologians would say, yes, Constantine signed the decree, but Christianity had already kept Sunday since apostolic times in memory of the resurrection. They would say, the emperor merely officialized what was already a consecrated practice. They would say, Constantine created nothing, he merely sanctioned. It was a skillful defense, intelligent. And to destroy it, Spinoza knew he would need to do something extraordinarily laborious. He would need to go back further, go back even further in time, go back to before Constantine, go back to the first 2 centuries of the Christian era, and discover, based on primary sources, what the liturgical practice of the first communities had actually been. That is what he did. And what he discovered was breathtaking, because, contrary to what later apologetics claimed, the observance of Sunday in the early Christian communities was irregular, dispersed, regional, and in many cases coexisted peacefully with the observance of Saturday. There was no general rule. There was no single apostolic decision. There was no abrupt transition at the time of Christ or immediately after. There was, on the contrary, a huge diversity, with entire communities in Syria, Egypt, Palestine, Ethiopia, parts of Asia Minor, that continued faithfully keeping the 7th day, Saturday, according to the 4th commandment, throughout the entire 1st century, all of the 2nd, all of the 3rd, and in some cases even later. Spinoza found references in Ignatius of Antioch, from the early 2nd century, that demonstrated that the tension between Saturday and Sunday was a live, controversial issue still being debated at that time. He found references in Justin, a 2nd century martyr, who described Christians gathering on the day called the sun, and used, note, exactly the same pagan expression, dies solis, that Constantine would later use in the decree. It was perhaps the first time that the expression appeared in the Christian vocabulary, and it appeared, note, without any explicit biblical justification, without any reference to a commandment of Christ or the apostles. Justin justified the choice for cosmological and symbolic reasons. It was the first day when God separated darkness from light, and it was also the day when Christ had resurrected. But at no point did he invoke a direct order, a commandment, an apostolic institution. The difference was enormous. It was the difference between a human choice and a divine order. Spinoza noted everything, compared it with the texts of the fourth commandment, compared it with the words of Christ himself in the Gospels, and concluded with the analytical coldness characteristic of him. There is not, in the entire New Testament, a single passage in which Christ or the apostles after him formally institute the replacement of Saturday with the first day of the week. The passages usually invoked by apologists, such as Acts 20 verse 7 or 1 Corinthians 16 verse 2, referred to isolated episodes, a meal in Troas, a practical instruction about collections, but at no moment decreed a change of holy day. It was an astonishing silence, a silence that filled pages and pages of the sacred texts, and where there was this silence, it was precisely there, Spinoza now realized, that the imperial church, centuries later, would erect its most imposing institutional edifice. But there was more. Spinoza, digging, also discovered how bloody the transition had been. The sources showed that during the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, the imperial church undertook a systematic campaign against the Christians called Sabbatarians, those who insisted on maintaining the observance of Saturday according to the original custom. In various local councils, these Christians were denounced as Judaizers, as heretics, as deviants. The Council of Laodicea, in the second half of the 4th century, in its 29th canon, stated textually, Christians should not Judaize by resting on Saturday, but should work on that day, and honor the day of the Lord by resting, if they can, as Christians. If they are found Judaizing, let them be anathema before Christ. Anathema. The word that in that context meant much more than a simple reproach. It meant expulsion from the community. It meant the cutting off of baptism. It meant, in many cases, the beginning of a persecution that ended in material ruin, exile, or death. Spinoza, upon reading that canon, felt a chill, because in that phrase he saw with absolute clarity the mechanics of what was happening. The imperial church was not merely officializing a custom, it was actively pursuing, criminalizing, anathematizing those who maintained the oldest custom. It was rewriting its own origin. It was erasing Saturday from official ecclesiastical memory. And it was, at the same time, constructing a new narrative according to which Sunday had always been the legitimate day, and Saturday had always been a Judaic practice, using that word, Judaic, in an increasingly pejorative sense, increasingly sinister, increasingly laden with hostility. And it was at this point that Spinoza, a Jew by birth, felt a different pain, an older pain, because that ecclesiastical anti-Judaism that he now identified in the records of the councils was not just a theological problem. It was the seed, he knew, of centuries of pogroms. It was the seed of medieval expulsions. It was the seed of the Inquisition's bonfires that had devoured the ancestors of his own family. In Lisbon, in Porto, in Coimbra, in Évora. It was the seed of the ghetto of Venice, of the massacres of the Rhine, of the carnage of 1348, when Europe, struck by the Black Death, decided to blame the Jews for poisoning the wells and burned entire communities of men, women, and children in their own homes. And all of that, Spinoza realized with glacial clarity, had begun at a very specific moment. It had begun when the imperial church decided, for political and theological reasons, to mark its identity through radical opposition to Judaism. And one of the most visible marks of that opposition was the replacement of Saturday with Sunday. It was the liturgical abolition of the holy day of Israel. It was the invention of the day of the Lord as a distinct, separate, opposing, hostile category to the day of the Jews. Sunday, Spinoza thought that night, with a pain so deep he could hardly breathe, was not just a pagan choice. It was also, beneath its golden surface of Byzantine mosaics, a weapon of identity, of exclusion, of hostility. A weapon that for 1,300 years had been aimed, week after week, against the people from whom he himself descended. And his own ancestors, fleeing the fires of Lisbon, taking refuge in Amsterdam, conversos who had been forced to pretend to convert to Catholicism to survive, those very ancestors had been victims generation after generation of that weapon. They had been forced to hide Saturday. They had been forced to pretend to go to Sunday Mass. They had been forced to conceal under threat of death the true faith they practiced in secret, in basements, in attics, with candles hidden inside clay jars. Spinoza thought of his grandfather, Pedro Isaque de Espinosa, who had arrived in Amsterdam as a young man, fleeing from Vidigueira in Portugal. He thought of his father, Miguel, who had worked so hard to build the small dried fruit shop at the port. He thought of how many times throughout his childhood he had heard at home that phrase repeated in a low voice by the older relatives. "Do not tell anyone, son. Do not tell anyone what we are. Do not tell anyone. Hide. Be silent. Dissemble. Survive." That was, he realized now, the true legacy of the Dies Solis, not just a swapped calendar, not just a modified liturgy, but an entire architecture of fear, of silencing, of identity built by the exclusion of the other. And yet, Spinoza did something that few would expect. He did not yield to hatred. He did not write, that night, an anti-ecclesiastical pamphlet. He did not compose an impassioned denunciation. On the contrary, he leaned over the notebook and, with his usual calm, wrote a single sentence. A sentence that years later would resonate throughout all his work. Not to laugh, not to cry, not to detest, but to understand. That would be his banner. That would be his discipline. Not to fall into the trap of emotional revolt. Not to respond to hatred with more hatred, but to understand. To understand with such depth that understanding itself would make it impossible for anyone who reached it to fall back into deception. It was a form of healing, not through emotion, through understanding. And to understand, there was still much to do. It was necessary to unravel the Council of Nicaea. It was necessary to unravel the letters of Eusebius. It was necessary to unravel the Codex Theodosianus. It was necessary to unravel the writings of the Church Fathers one by one, comparing, contrasting, dating, authenticating. It was work for years, perhaps decades. And while Spinoza mentally traced this immense research program, he did not know, could not know, that on the other side of the city at that very moment, in a well-heated office of the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam, 3 rabbis were sitting around an oak table. They were drinking sweet wine from small crystal cups. They were conversing in low voices, and the name they pronounced repeatedly in an increasingly grave tone was his, Baruch de Spinoza, the son of Miguel. Something was brewing, something was approaching, and the young lens polisher, bent over his papers by the light of his single candle, still had no idea. The first warning came through a friend. It was a Thursday morning, in mid-February, when the cold of Amsterdam began to lose its cruelest rigor, but the sky remained overcast, uniformly grey, the colour of wet stone. Spinoza was in the small workshop where he worked, on Lange Houtstraat, polishing a convex lens for a German client who needed to improve the accuracy of his microscope. His hands worked mechanically, with that monastic precision he had acquired in recent years. But the mind, as usual, was elsewhere. The mind was still in the 4th century, at a council in Laodicea, reading canons in ecclesiastical Latin. It was then that the door opened. It was Saul Levi Mortera. Or rather, it was not Saul Levi Mortera in person, which would have been astonishing, because the old chief rabbi of the Jewish community in Amsterdam did not usually leave the comfort of his home to visit polishing workshops. It was an emissary of his, a young man named Jacob, son of a butcher in the community, with a round face and worried eyes, who quickly entered, closed the door, and said without even greeting, "Baruch, I need to warn you. Rabbi Mortera knows." Spinoza laid the lens on the cloth. He looked at the young man with those huge, calm, almost amused brown eyes. "Knows what, Jacob?" "Everything. He knows what you read. He knows what you write. He knows which books you took from Rioverts. He has spies. He always has. I overheard it by chance last night at my father's house. There were 3 rabbis talking. They were talking about you. They were talking about excommunication. Harem, Baruch. They are planning the harem. The harem. Spinoza had known the word since he was a boy. He knew its weight. The harem was the maximum curse of the rabbinic tradition. It was the total, definitive expulsion of a soul from the communion of Israel. There was no worse punishment. It was worse than death in a sense, because natural death leaves the soul intact. But the harem cuts the soul from the tree, from the trunk, from ancestral continuity, and casts it alone into the dark, without family, without people, without name. Spinoza said nothing for long seconds. He just kept looking at young Jacob. Then he smiled faintly, a sad smile, without bitterness. "Thank you, my friend. You are good to come and warn me, but I was already expecting it." "You were already expecting it?" Jacob was perplexed. "Baruch, don't you understand? They are going to publicly curse you. They will forbid your family from speaking to you. They will forbid any Jew from coming within 4 cubits of you. It will be exactly like what happened with Uriel da Costa, remember? Do you remember what he did in the end?" Spinoza remembered. Uriel da Costa, 22 years earlier, had been excommunicated by the same community, exactly by the same rabbis. He had endured the pressure for years. He had been forced to be readmitted, to lie on the floor of the synagogue and be trampled, literally trampled, by all the members of the congregation who entered for prayer. And shortly after that public humiliation, in some room of some house in Amsterdam, he had taken a pistol, pressed the barrel to his temple, and fired. That was the fate Jacob feared for Spinoza. But Spinoza, with that serenity that would later be the philosophical hallmark of his existence, shook his head slowly. "I am not Uriel da Costa, Jacob. Uriel wanted to return to the community. He wanted deep down to be forgiven. He wanted the warmth that had been taken from him. That's why he accepted being trampled. That's why, afterwards, he couldn't bear it. I am not going to ask to return. I don't need to return." Jacob fell silent. He looked at Spinoza, as one looks at someone one does not fully understand. And then, as if he suddenly understood that there was nothing more to say, he opened the door, and before leaving he simply said, "Take care, Baruch. For God's sake, take care." The door closed. The small bell above it tinkled once, and Spinoza was left alone in the silent workshop, with the half-polished lens on the cloth, the smell of linseed oil hanging in the air, and his new certainty hanging like a dark angel over his shoulders. They were going to come. Sooner or later, they were going to come. Spinoza finished polishing the lens that day with the same calm as always. He delivered it to the German client in the afternoon. He received payment, a few silver coins. He walked home slowly, through the narrow, damp streets, and only when he entered his little room on the 2nd floor, closed the door, and sat down in the small wooden chair in front of the cluttered desk, did he finally allow himself to feel what he had avoided feeling all day. It was not fear, it was not exactly fear. It was an immense, deep, ancient sadness. Sadness for the mother he did not know well enough, for the father who had died 3 years earlier, for the brothers he would lose forever when the decree was pronounced. Sadness for childhood friends who would cross the street to avoid encountering him. Sadness for all of Amsterdam, that damp, cold city of canals and tulips, which was still the only home he had ever had. But it was also, he felt keenly, a sadness that came accompanied by something more. Something that, for the first time in his life, resembled a strange form of freedom. Because while he had belonged fully to the community, while he had been the exemplary son of the merchant Miguel de Espinosa, while he had been the young prodigy of the Talmudic classes, he had carried with him unknowingly 1,000 small invisible commitments, 1,000 thin little chains that limited his thinking, 1,000 tacit boundaries that told him, without needing to say, "Up to here you can think, from here on you cannot." And when those chains broke all at once, on the day of the harem, yes, it would hurt. It would hurt a lot. But for the first time he would be, in the most radical and risky sense of the word, free. It was this freedom that was approaching, terrible, brutal, glorious, that made him, that night, write in his notebook a sentence that later researchers would find among his papers and forever dispute its meaning. When a man owes nothing to the community, he begins to owe everything to himself. The following months were strangely normal. Spinoza continued going to the synagogue on Saturdays, as always. He continued greeting the rabbis with the respectful nod of his head, as always. He continued having tea at the neighborhood cafe with young acquaintances, talking about the rains, the harvests, the ships that had arrived from the East Indies. On the outside, nothing had changed. On the inside, everything was different. Inside, he knew that each greeting was a possible last greeting. Each tea was a possible last tea. Each Saturday was a possible last Saturday, inside that temple where he had prayed since he was 8 years old. It was during this strange social quarantine, when he already knew, but had not yet been formally declared, that Spinoza made one of the most disturbing discoveries of all his research. One night, he was reading a rare copy of a letter attributed to Eusebius of Caesarea, addressed to a certain Constantius. It was not a very well-known letter. It had survived in fragments, in a Greek codex that circulated among the Protestant scholars of Holland. And in that letter, in an almost careless paragraph, Eusebius made an extraordinary admission. He confessed, in ecclesiastical Latin that Spinoza translated 3 times to make sure he understood correctly, that the transfer of the holy day from Saturday to Sunday had been a decision ecclesiae, of the Church, and not a direct institution of the apostles or of Christ. Ecclesiae, by the hand of the Church, not by the hand of God. Spinoza laid down the letter. He looked at the flame of the candle. He felt his heart beating fast. That was a devastating document. One of the very fathers of ecclesiastical history, a court writer of Constantine, the official biographer of the golden age of imperial Christianity, admitted himself, in a forgotten fragment, that the change had been a human decision and not a divine one. The confession was there. It had survived. It had crossed 13 centuries of censorship, book-burning, selective copies, ideologically committed translators, and it had landed that specific night on that specific table, under those specific brown eyes. Spinoza transcribed the passage carefully. He dated it. He noted the references. And then he did something that perhaps no other scholar of the time would do. He cross-referenced this passage with 15 different sources to verify its authenticity. He compared styles. He compared vocabulary. He compared historical context. Everything matched. The fragment was genuine. He had found there at that exact moment the documentary proof, handwritten by a father of the imperial church, that the Christian Sunday was a later human invention, juxtaposed to the original sacred texts, and not a divine commandment. It was pure philosophical gold, dangerously pure gold. And as Spinoza contemplated his discovery, with that mixture of exhilaration and terror that only great investigators know, the candle before him crackled. It trembled suddenly more than usual, as if it had felt a cold draught. Spinoza looked at the window, automatically. The window was closed. There was no draught. But he had the impression for a fraction of a second that someone was watching him, behind him, from a distance, through the walls, through the centuries. And he would not be able to say later whether that impression was the shadow of Eusebius returning from the 4th century to see what he was doing with his confessional fragment, or whether it was the closer shadow of the 3 rabbis sitting at that moment at the oak table, a few streets away, planning the harem that would soon change the course of his existence. July 27th, 1656. Friday. It was early afternoon, and it was hot, unusually hot for the summer in Amsterdam, with the sky a fragile blue, streaked with a few very high white clouds. The streets around the Portuguese synagogue, on what was called Houtgracht, were full. People coming and going, street vendors, children running between the legs of adults, women carrying baskets of bread and cheese. It was an ordinary day for everyone, except for one. For Baruch Spinoza, 23 years old, lens polisher. That day the world was going to split in half. A formal summons had arrived in the morning. A short document, written in Hebrew and Portuguese, sealed with the community's seal, delivered by an official from the Talmud Torah congregation in Amsterdam. The document simply informed that Baruch de Spinoza, son of Miguel de Spinoza, should appear that afternoon at the specified time at the synagogue to hear a decision of the congregation regarding him. There were no details. There was no justification, there was no right of defense. just the summons. Spinoza read the document without changing his expression. He laid it on the table. He went to the small copper basin, washed his face, put on his best clothes, a simple black tunic, dark trousers, polished black shoes, combed his brown hair calmly. He glanced briefly at himself in the small cracked mirror hanging on the wall. It seemed to him that it was perhaps the last time in a long time that he would see himself as the son of that community. He left home at 2 in the afternoon. He walked slowly through the cobblestone streets, crossed 2 small bridges, went around a small fish market where cats fought over scraps thrown on the ground. He did not quicken his pace. He did not slow down. He just walked with that regular cadence, slightly bent forward, which was already his mark. He nodded to 3 or 4 people along the way. They nodded back, still, for the last time. When he left the synagogue a few hours later, no one would greet him again. He arrived at the synagogue door. He climbed the 3 stone steps. He pushed the heavy, dark wooden door with iron nails on the hinges. The air inside was cooler. It smelled of candle wax, old cedar, musty books, the smell of the faith of his ancestors. The synagogue was full beyond the usual. The men's benches on the right side were occupied to the last row. The women's galleries, up above, behind the trellises, were also packed. Spinoza noticed immediately, this was not just any judicial session. It was a public ritual, a collective demonstration. The entire community had been summoned to witness. He walked down the central aisle, feeling the gazes resting on him like insects. He did not look at anyone in particular. He kept his head held high, but not arrogantly, with that calm dignity of those who know they have committed no crime and who have already accepted, in peace with themselves, what is going to happen. Before the Aron HaKodesh, the sacred ark where the Torah scrolls were kept, a small table covered with black cloth was set up. On the table, 3 long candles were lit. Behind the table, standing, wearing their most solemn liturgical garments, were 4 men. Saul Levi Mortera, the chief rabbi, tall, thin, grey beard cut to a point. Isaac Abuabda Fonseca beside him. Manasseh ben Israel, the famous one, with a darker, longer, more traditional beard. And a 4th rabbi, younger, whose name some later accounts vary. When Spinoza stopped in front of the table, there was absolute silence. Rabbi Mortera spoke first. He spoke in Portuguese, the language of the Sephardic community in Amsterdam. His voice was cutting but controlled, without theatrics, without tremor. The voice of a man who was fulfilling a duty he considered tragic but inevitable. Baruch de Spinoza, son of Miguel de Espinosa, appears before this congregation accused of horrendous heresies, abominable opinions and wicked acts. The gentlemen of the Mamadot, this holy congregation, and the rabbis who are here have repeatedly deliberated about your conduct. We have tried by all means to steer you away from your errors. We offered correction, we offered silence, we even offered material bribes, as you must remember. Nothing was enough. You persist, and every day you delve deeper into teachings contrary to the faith of our fathers. Spinoza did not respond. He had not been invited to respond. This was not a trial, it was the reading of a sentence already written. The rabbi paused. He raised a scroll, unrolled it, and began to read, now in Hebrew, with the ritual intonation of the most serious sentences of the rabbinic tradition, the text of the Herem. The text began by invoking the avenging angels, invoking the ancient curses of the prophets, invoking the prohibitions described in Deuteronomy, and then pronounced with those words that even today, read by any researcher, make the heart tighten. By the sentence of the angels, by the word of the saints, we banish, expel, execrate, and curse Baruch de Spinoza, with the consent of the holy God and this holy congregation, before these holy books of the law. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises up. Cursed be he in his going out, and cursed be he in his coming in. May the Lord not forgive him. May the wrath and fury of the Lord be kindled against him, and cast upon him all the curses written in the book of the law. And may the Lord erase his name from under heaven, and may he separate him for evil from all the tribes of Israel. The rabbi's voice fell word by word upon Spinoza like heavy stones, And he there standing, without moving, without lowering his eyes, without crying, without responding. We warn everyone not to speak to him orally, nor in writing, that no one render him any service, that no one dwell with him under the same roof, nor come within 4 cubits of him, nor read anything composed or written by him. The candles trembled. The rabbi reached the end of the text. There was a moment of silence in which no one dared to breathe. Then his voice added the last ritual words, and the other 3 rabbis responded with a solemn Amen. And it was then, at that exact moment, that something happened that many later chroniclers would describe, but whose profound meaning only Spinoza and perhaps God himself, if God existed in the sense that those men believed, would ever understand. Spinoza turned slowly. He did not say a word. He did not ask for anything. He did not defend himself. He did not cry. He did not plead. He simply, with the calm cadence with which he had entered, began to walk back down the central aisle toward the door. And as he walked, he noticed that many of those present averted their gaze. Others pressed their lips together. A woman up there, in the women's gallery, sobbed quietly, perhaps an aunt, perhaps a cousin, perhaps a neighbor who had known him since he was little. But no one, absolutely no one, raised their voice in his defense. When he reached the door, he pushed it with his right hand. The door opened. The strong afternoon light entered the synagogue. Spinoza crossed the threshold. He stepped out into the street, and the door closed behind him. For a moment there on the stone staircase, he felt a real vertigo. His legs almost failed him, but he steadied himself. He breathed deeply the warm summer air of Amsterdam. He heard far away seagulls screaming near the port. He smelled the seaweed coming from the canals. He looked at the sky so clear and blue, and he began to descend the 3 steps. He was alone. For the first time in 23 years, he was completely, wholly, irreversibly alone. And it was at that moment, according to his own later testimony recorded years later in a letter to a friend, that something unexpected happened inside him. He did not cry. He did not feel defeated. He did not feel humiliated. Instead, he felt a strange, deep oceanic calm, as if a huge, ancient door had just opened inside, in his chest. As if everything that weighed, all the 1,000 invisible commitments he had mentioned before, all the tacit boundaries of thought had fallen all at once. As if he now, for the first time in his entire life, were truly a man. And it was thus, alone on the staircase of that synagogue, before that closed door, that Baruch de Spinoza became Bento de Spinoza. He changed his name, from Hebrew to Latin. Both meant blessed, but the first had been given by his parents. The second he would give to himself. It was the name of the new man who had just been born. He walked back home. He had nowhere else to return except to the small room on the 2nd floor. His family would avoid him from that afternoon on. His brothers would treat him as dead, his cousins as if he had never existed. His old friends would cross the street to avoid running into him. But in the small room, on the small table, the papers awaited him. The notes, the notebook, the fragment of Eusebius, the decree of Constantine, the research. He took off his shoes. He sat down. He picked up the pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and continued exactly where he had left off 2 days before. As if nothing had happened, as if the maximum curse of the rabbinic tradition, solemnly pronounced that very afternoon by 4 rabbis before an entire congregation, had not even touched the surface of his soul. And perhaps it had not. The years following the Herem were, on the surface, years of poverty. Spinoza moved from Amsterdam to Rijnsburg, a small village near Leiden, where he rented a modest room in the house of a Protestant surgeon. He lived off what he earned polishing lenses, a task he performed with such skill that clients began to come from afar. Christian Huygens, the great astronomer, and later Henry Oldenburg, secretary of the Royal Society of London, would order glasses from the excommunicated Jewish polisher of Amsterdam. His small pale hands worked the glass hour after hour, day after day, and the fine silica dust that detached itself was entering, without him realizing it, into his lungs. There, in that decade, the disease that would later, in 1677 at the age of 44, lead him to death was beginning to form. Phthisis. Pulmonary tuberculosis aggravated by chronic inhalation of dust. But while the surface was poor, the subsoil was of a richness that still astonishes today. Because in those years of Rheinsberg, and later in those of Voorburg, and finally in those of The Hague, Bento de Spinoza wrote. He wrote as perhaps no other European philosopher had ever written. He wrote the treatise on the reform of the understanding. He wrote the principles of Descartes' philosophy. He wrote the political treatise. He wrote the monumental theological political treatise, published anonymously in 1670. And he finally wrote that very strange work that would change the history of Western thought forever, The Ethics Demonstrated in the Manner of Geometers, a book composed entirely of propositions, demonstrations, scholia, and corollaries, as if it were a treatise of Euclid, only about God, about the human soul, about passions, about freedom. And it was especially in the theological political treatise that all the investigation initiated that winter of 1656 finally found its public expression. The book, Spinoza, published in Amsterdam, in Latin, with the author's name omitted from the cover. The printing was done by a bookseller friend, with the place of printing deliberately falsified to Hamburg to confuse the authorities. But in no time, all the intellectuals of Europe knew who the true author was. The scandal was immediate and colossal. The book was immediately banned, first by the Dutch Calvinist authorities, then by the Reformed Synod, then by the Roman Inquisition, which included it in the famous Index Librorum Prohibitorum the very next year, and finally even by Jewish rabbis who renewed the old curses against Spinoza. The work was characterized by its enemies, under various penalties, as forged in hell by an apostate Jew and the devil, as the most impious book ever published, as a poison intended to corrupt the souls of the weak. But within that forbidden book, hidden among philological analyses of the Hebrew prophets, surgical dissections of miracles, refutations of biblical inerrancy, and pioneering defenses of freedom of thought, were the conclusions matured over almost 15 years of research. The conclusions that Spinoza had begun to outline 13 years earlier in that little room in Amsterdam by the light of a candle over the decree of Constantine. The central, overwhelming thesis, articulated with that mathematical rigor that was his hallmark, was this: institutional religion, as it developed in the Christian West, was not essentially a search for divine truth. It was an instrument of political obedience. It was a structure of social control built over the centuries through human decisions, imperial decrees, conciliar manipulations, biased translations, selective censorship, and then presented to the masses as if it were of divine origin. And the dies solis of Constantine, although it was not the main focus of the book, appeared at various points as a paradigmatic example of the mechanism. Spinoza demonstrated, with sources, with citations, with textual cross-references, how a deeply human, deeply political, deeply dated decision had been transformed over the centuries into a supposedly eternal, supposedly universal, supposedly divine obligation. And how, in that process, institutional Christianity had lost contact with what had been its original vibration, the direct, simple, ethical teaching of a Jewish carpenter named Yeshua, who spoke to the poor on the hills of Galilee, and who never, in all the Gospels, had ordered the alteration of the holy day of his fathers. But Spinoza, and this is what perhaps characterizes him most as a thinker, did not stop at the denunciation. He did not write just to accuse. He wrote to build. Build what? A new, free, rational way of relating to what he continued to call, with admirable persistence, God. Only that his God was no longer the God of the rabbis of his childhood, nor the God of the priests of his enemies. It was a different God, a God that he, in a famous phrase, identified with nature itself, Deus sive natura, God that is nature, and which he described as an infinite, eternal, necessary substance, in whose reality everything that exists is inscribed as a necessary expression. This philosophical God, Spinoza's God, had no calendar. He had no preferred day of the week. He had no emperor to legislate in his name. He had no bishops. He had no synagogues. He had no cathedrals. But he was, he said, in every star, in every drop of rain falling in the canals of Amsterdam, in every beat of his own sick heart, in every lens he polished from morning to night in the small workshop in Rheinsberg. And it was precisely because this God was like this, omnipresent, infinite, impersonal, free from all human calendars, that Spinoza could, in the end, forgive. Forgive Constantine. Forgive the rabbis who had excommunicated him. Forgive the bishops who had included him in the index. Forgive even that young fanatic in Amsterdam, who a few months after the herem had tried to stab him in the street as he was leaving the municipal theatre, Spinoza had instinctively sidestepped, and the knife had only torn his coat, leaving him with a thin scar on his back that he would preserve, almost as a relic, until the end of his life, as a reminder of how far men go when they feel threatened in their most supposedly certain beliefs. Forgive all, not out of weakness, not out of naivety, but out of understanding, because the program of all his philosophy, formulated with brutal clarity in a posthumous book, was this: omnia quae fiunt, necessario fiunt. Everything that happens, happens necessarily. There is no metaphysical guilt. There are only causes and effects, mechanisms and unfoldings, immense natural systems in which human passions unfold, according to laws as inevitable as the laws of the planets. Constantine acted as he did because he was Constantine. The rabbis acted as they did because they were those rabbis. The fanatics attack because they are fanatics. Accepting this does not mean agreeing with it. It simply means ceasing to waste the soul in useless revolt and using the soul instead to understand. And understanding, Spinoza said, is the highest form of love that a human being can achieve. Amor intellectualis Dei, the intellectual love of God. To love the whole structure just as it is, with all its harshness, with all its cruelties, with all its centuries of errors, and still love it because it is. Because to love what is, and not what we would like it to be, is the only true liberation available to the human spirit. It was with this philosophy that Spinoza traversed the last 20 years of his life. He traversed them in voluntary poverty. He was offered inheritances, and he refused. He was offered the chair of philosophy at the University of Heidelberg with a generous salary and freedom of thought, and he refused. He wrote a polite response explaining that he would only accept if he could continue to think exactly as he thought. And since the Palatine Elector could not guarantee that in writing, he preferred to remain poor and free. He was offered pensions and he refused. He accepted only at the end of his life a small annuity from his friend Simon de Vries, but reduced to half the original value because he found the initial amount excessive. He lived with a frugality that astonished visitors. He ate little, drank less, had a simple bed, a desk, a few books, and a single cup of coffee a day, reports say, which he prepared himself in the morning. He received illustrious visitors, diplomats, generals, scientists, philosophers. The famous Leibniz visited him in The Hague, although he later tried to hide the fact from all of Europe. So dangerous was the association. They talked for hours, they say, and Leibniz, according to reports, left that conversation with more ideas than he had entered with. And in all these meetings, in all these conversations, in all these books and letters, no one ever heard Bento de Spinoza utter a word against the men who had excommunicated him. Not against Constantino, not against the rabbis, not against the priests, not against the failed assassin. Nothing. Silence, understanding silence, lucid silence. Silence that was not complicity, because the work was there, terrible, demolishing, eternal, but was pure serenity. It was during those years, perhaps in the first half of the 1660s, that Spinoza began to notice, seeing the reflections of his increasingly thin and pale face in the water-filled mirrors of the house, that he was becoming ill. The cough, initially discreet, was becoming more frequent. The small red spots on the handkerchief, after each fit, were getting larger. The lungs were slowly filling with scars from the glass dust. But he did not stop polishing. He did not stop writing. He did not stop thinking. And meanwhile, far away in Rome, in the Vatican, someone was also thinking of him with growing unease, with alarm, thinking of him with an increasingly clear sense that if that Dutch philosopher continued to write, and if his books continued to circulate, something terrible, something truly catastrophic for the entire structure of the institutional church, could, sooner or later, come to light. It was these Vatican thoughts that, at a certain moment, between 1670 and 1673, would lead to the preparation of a letter. A long letter, in Latin, drafted with extreme caution, sealed with the papal seal, secretly addressed to the apostolic nuncio in Brussels. A letter whose existence was only revealed, and even then partially at the end of the 19th century, when some Vatican archives were partially opened to external researchers. And the content of this letter, in what survived fragmentarily, concerned a plan, a simple plan, a plan that involved the name of Bento de Spinoza, lens polisher, resident in The Hague, house number recorded in the minutes, author of works considered particularly dangerous to the faith. What exactly this plan contained, whether it was merely intensified surveillance, whether it was a coordinated defamation campaign, whether it was something darker and more final, is a matter historians still discuss. But what is known is that in those same years, Spinoza began to notice strange things in The Hague. Shadows standing in the street in front of his window at night, tampered letters arriving late, landlords asking questions they had not asked before, unknown visitors requesting meetings that he, with his characteristic politeness, politely declined. And it was on a specific night, in the winter of 1673, 2 years before his death, that something happened that he would never report publicly, but would mention, in a few cryptic lines, in a private letter to Henry Oldenburg in London. He heard, outside the house around 3 in the morning, 3 short knocks on the street door. And when, against his initial intention, he went to the window and peeked through the curtain's gap, he saw in the deserted street, under the pale moonlight, a single hooded man standing in front of the door. A man holding a cloth package in his hands, a cloth package that was exactly the size and shape of a leather satchel, the kind in which at that time letters from the Vatican traveled to the rest of Europe. Spinoza did not open the door. He stayed there, behind the curtain, at the second-floor window, with the candle deliberately extinguished, so that the man in the street would not realize he was being watched. He breathed slowly, controlled, as one studies a rare insect. The hooded man down below remained motionless for almost a full minute. Then he raised his hand, lifted the package again as if to ensure the size was correct, and then, a curious gesture, briefly pressed it to his chest, as if blessing an object before handing it over. And it was at that moment that Spinoza saw the thing that would confirm everything. Beneath the hood, in the dim light of the moon refracted by the ice of the street, a metallic glint escaped for an instant, small, discreet, hanging around the man's neck by a chain, a crucifix, and not just any crucifix. It was one of those that the ecclesiastical emissaries of the Sacred College used, with the foot stylized in the shape of a key, a symbol of papal messenger, a pectoral crucifix, one that only the bearers of direct papal correspondence were permitted to wear on secret missions through Protestant Europe. Spinoza felt, for the first time in many years, his heart race, not out of fear. He had long since died to the fear of death, but from the intellectual confirmation of a hypothesis that he, with his characteristic analytical caution, had avoided formulating aloud. He was being watched, not by the local Calvinists, not by the rabbis, not by the intolerant Protestants of Holland, but by the very center of the institutional church, by Rome, by the Vatican, by the machine that ultimately governed the entire symbolic universe, of which Constantino's decree had been the first cornerstone. 13 centuries later, they were still there, still vigilant, still concerned, still capable of sending emissaries across seas and principles to deliver packages at the door of a lens polisher. The hooded man, after that extraordinary gesture, placed the package carefully before the door, as if placing an offering on an altar. He then turned and walked silently down the street. His footsteps marked a perfect path over the thin layer of freshly fallen snow and disappeared around the corner by the canal. Spinoza did not go down, not immediately. He first waited another hour, watching from the corners of the window all the street, keeping an eye out for any accomplice who might have stayed behind to watch the watcher. There was no one. The street remained deserted. Only the cold wind ruffled the tips of the snow on the rooftops. It was only just before dawn, when the first grey signs began to appear behind the city's bell towers, that Spinoza descended silently. The wooden steps creaked under his thin feet. He reached the door, opened it carefully. The package was there, on the step, intact, covered in a fine dusting of snow. Spinoza picked it up. It was light, lighter than it seemed. He brought it inside, closed the door, locked it twice, and something he rarely did, and went back up to his small study. In the dim light of the candle he had relit, he opened the cloth with careful gestures. Inside the cloth was, exactly as he had sensed, a leather satchel. A diplomatic satchel, the kind used by apostolic nuncios to carry official letters. The seal of the satchel was intact, a lead seal, with the papal tiara and the two crossed keys in relief. And there was also, something Spinoza only noticed on the second glance, a small note, folded 4 times, unsigned, written in ecclesiastical Latin, a single sentence, 4 words, tibi soli benedicte, lege, to you alone, bento, read. Spinoza set the note down, looked at the satchel, looked at the locked door, looked at the window, sat down in the simple wooden chair in front of the desk, and stayed there for long minutes doing nothing, just thinking. Was it a trap? It was plausible, more than plausible. It was, in logical terms, the most likely hypothesis. Vatican emissaries did not cross continents to deliver genuine documents to heretics in The Hague. They crossed continents to set traps, to provoke compromising public statements, to provide pretexts for future condemnations, to corrupt, to implicate, to destroy. But then, and here Spinoza, with his characteristic discipline, turned the coin to the opposite side. Why would they do it in such an elaborate way? If the goal was merely to compromise him, why risk sending an emissary with a genuine pectoral? Why take the chance that the philosopher, seeing the crucifix, would identify the origin? And why, above all, write in the note, to you alone, bento, such a direct, personal formula so outside the usual standards of ecclesiastical diplomacy? There was another hypothesis, stranger, more disturbing, perhaps more beautiful, that the package did indeed come from within the Vatican, but not as an official act, as an act of someone from within, someone who, having access to the papal archives, and having discovered something, and having read the books of the Dutch philosopher, and having somehow reached the silent conclusion that that man in The Hague was perhaps the only worthy interlocutor of what he had found, someone like that would have forged the mission, used the official channels as cover, and sent clandestinely, on the margins of Rome, on the margins of all hierarchy, the material to the only man capable, at that historical moment, of reading it with the proper understanding. It was a romantic hypothesis. Spinoza, by his nature, distrusted Romanization, but it was also, from a psychological point of view, perfectly plausible. In every large institution, in every secular bureaucracy, there is always, somewhere in the labyrinth, a dissatisfied spirit. An archivist, a secretary, a young cardinal, someone who, having read old papers for years, has seen too much and lost sleep. And such a spirit, if armed with enough courage, is capable of absolutely improbable gestures. After weighing both hypotheses, Spinoza decided on a third way. He would not open the package that night. He would wait. He would observe the street for an entire week. He would check for any developments. If more emissaries appeared, if more letters arrived, if there was any sign of a trap in progress, he would burn the satchel without even opening it, and nothing would have happened. But if everything remained silent, if the surveillance did not deepen, if the package remained, in the absence of subsequent provocations, as a single isolated gesture, then yes, then he would open it. He waited. He waited 7 days. For 7 days, Spinoza carried out his routine with meticulous normality. He woke at the same hour, had his coffee, went to the workshop, polished lenses for 6 straight hours, received 2 clients, one of whom was an astronomer from Utrecht, with whom he exchanged greetings and a brief dialogue about the refraction of light through double prisms, had bread and cheese for lunch, returned to his room, wrote pages of the Ethics, exactly the pages that correspond today to the end of Part 4 of the book, on human servitude, and the beginning of Part 5, on freedom. Had a light dinner, went to bed early, everything normal. But during those same weeks he watched. He watched the street before leaving home, watched the passers-by along the route to the workshop, watched the clients who entered, watched the landlords of the building where he rented the room. Everything continued exactly the same. No new shadows, no intercepted letters, no indiscreet questions, no unknown person asking for him anywhere in the city. It was as if that specific night had been a single pulse, a single gesture, as if the emissary had come, delivered, and disappeared, and nothing more was to happen. On the 8th day at night, Spinoza decided. He locked the room door twice, closed the curtains, lit 2 candles instead of 1 to ensure enough light, sat down at the desk, took the leather satchel, and with the small knife he used to open letters, broke the lead seal. Inside the satchel were 3 things. The first was a thin bundle of parchments, 8 sheets in total, written in careful ecclesiastical Latin with the trained handwriting of an official scribe. The sheets were numbered. The first began with the formula Acta Sessionis Secundae Concilii Nicaeni, Anno Domini 325, minutes of the second session of the Council of Nicaea, in the year of our Lord 325. The second was a letter, an old letter. The paper was yellowed, fragile, with stains of time. The handwriting was different from that of the minutes, more nervous, more slanted, more personal. The dating was Mediolani idibus Junii, Anno Consulatu Constantini Quintum, Milan, Ides of June, in the 5th consulship of Constantino. That is, June of 319, 2 years before the decree of Die Solis. The third was a small handwritten codex of 12 or 15 sheets only, bound in dark goatskin, without a title. When Spinoza opened it, he saw that it was written in ancient Greek, not in the later Byzantine ecclesiastical Greek, but in the purest and most economical classical Greek of some scholar from late antiquity. No author's name, no explicit dating. But, as he flipped through quickly, he immediately identified the style, the vocabulary, certain grammatical constructions. He felt his blood run cold. It was, or seemed to be, a copy of a text whose existence had been suspected by generations of European scholars, but whose whereabouts had been considered lost for over 1,000 years. A text that some ancient references called simply the Memoirs of Hosius, the old bishop of Cordoba, personal advisor to Constantino, effective president of the Council of Nicaea, a man who supposedly knew all the political secrets of the emperor. Hosius had died under bitter circumstances, exiled by his own, in the final years of the 4th century. It was only said, that before he died he had written some confessional memoirs in Greek, which circulated briefly in some monasteries of the East, and then disappeared. Some later voices, in the 6th century, had mentioned the text as if it still existed in some archive, but from the 7th century on, nothing. Absolute silence. Scholars considered it lost forever, like so many other texts from late antiquity, burned in library fires, forgotten on damp shelves, devoured by the rats of time. And now that night in The Hague, under the light of 2 candles, Bento de Spinoza, excommunicated lens polisher, held in his pale hands what seemed to be an intact copy of that text. His hands trembled. He set the codex down on the desk, stood up, walked 3 steps to the window, came back, sat down, stood up again. He did not know, for the first time in many years, what to feel. Was it genuine? How to know? Spinoza knew the history of the forgery of ecclesiastical documents. He knew of the donation of Constantino, that immense fraud by which the medieval church for centuries had justified its territorial powers over the West, and which Lorenzo Valla in the 15th century had unmasked as a late Carolingian forgery with masterful philological analysis. He knew that the institutional church over the centuries had produced and destroyed more documents than any other human entity ever had. He would know, therefore, that any package coming from Rome, even the most innocent in appearance, should be treated with the most skeptical of all philological cautions. But there was also the opposite possibility. There was the possibility, small, fragile, but real, that after 1,000 years of clandestine circulation within the Vatican archives, After having passed from scribe to scribe, from cardinal to cardinal, from drawer to drawer, that dangerous text had finally found hands brave enough to liberate it. Hands that had taken it out of the archive, hands that had wrapped it in cloth, hands that had delivered it in the snow of The Hague to the only philosopher in Europe who might be capable, intellectually, of reading it to the end without going mad. Spinoza took a deep breath. He decided not to make any hasty decisions about authenticity. He would treat the document with total skeptical rigor, as if it were false until proven otherwise. He would compare each sentence with external sources. He would cross-check each name, each date, each geographical reference, each linguistic peculiarity. If the text survived this integral philological autopsy, then, and only then, would he consider the hypothesis of authenticity. He first took the letter from Milan, dated 319. He decided to start with the simplest piece. He brought the candle closer, leaned over the yellowed parchment, and began to read. The first sentence, written in careful Latin, said the following: Hosio, episcopo cordubensi, frater carissima in domino salutem, de diequem populis omnibus imperi nostri sanctum proclamare cogitamus, opus est ut tecum, quem omnium conciliariorum nostrorum prudentissimum existimamus, occulte loquamur. To Hosius, Bishop of Cordoba, dearest brother in the Lord, greetings. About the day we intend to proclaim holy for all the peoples of our empire, it is necessary that we speak with you secretly, whom we consider the wisest of all our advisers. And just below, in a gesture that would make future generations of historians hold their breath, came the signature, written not by the hand of the scribe, but beneath the Latin formula, in ancient autograph characters, in slightly different ink. A single word in Greek, 3 letters only, but unmistakable to anyone who had studied the coins and medals of the period. Consticre, the personal imperial abbreviation of Constantino. It was his private signature, the same one he used in more intimate correspondences, outside the official protocol. In communications he wanted to keep off the record. Spinoza set the parchment down, averted his eyes, looked at the candle flame, felt again that deep vertigo he had felt years earlier in Amsterdam, on the first night he discovered the decree of Dies Solis. But this time, the vertigo was of another order. Because the decree of Dies Solis had been a public official document directed at the masses, a private letter addressed to the closest advisor 2 years before the decree was something else. It was the kitchen. It was the backstage. It was the place where, perhaps, the true reason for that entire political operation was documented. Spinoza closed his eyes, breathed deeply 3 times. Then, with hands he forced to stop trembling, he took the parchment again and continued to read. And what he read, that specific night, in his small house in The Hague, under 2 candles that flickered slightly with the cold draught coming through the window cracks, what he read made his breath suspend for almost a full minute, as if the air had decided, at that exact moment, to forever abandon the memory of the world. The letter was short. It was no more than 2 pages. But in those 2 pages, Constantino, with that characteristic coldness of generals who have become accustomed to planning entire campaigns in a single conversation, laid out to Hosius, Bishop of Cordoba, his internal reasoning about the operation he was maturing. The letter began by bluntly recalling the political situation of the empire in that year of 319. The emperor pointed out, with the sobriety of one who would invent resources before a battle, 3 fundamental realities. First, the religious heterogeneity. The empire was a mosaic of cults, in which the traditional worshippers of the unconquered sun, more numerous in all the legions and in almost all the large cities, coexisted with growing tensions alongside the Christian communities. Secondly, the fragmentation of the liturgical calendar. Each province, each city, each cult, each profession kept its own rhythm of feasts, fasts, and rests, making any administrative, military, or commercial synchronization on an imperial scale impossible. And thirdly, and this was the point that most concerned the emperor, the inflammable nature of the Sabbatarian Christian communities, especially in the eastern provinces which, by ostentatiously keeping the Sabbath, marked their identity by the simultaneous distancing from Roman paganism and from the already more Romanized Christianity of the Western communities, thus creating an impossible triple fracture to govern. Constantino then proposed a solution, and this solution, expressed in a phrase that Spinoza transcribed 3 times to be sure he had read it correctly, sounded like this in direct Latin: Si unum diem omnibus impositurus sum, portitut hictis neutri partii totus pertinit, sed eo modo formari ut omnes in eo se invenire possint. If I am to impose a single day on all, it is necessary that this day does not belong entirely to either side, but that it be formulated in such a way that all can find themselves in it. It was the key. Spinoza, upon reading that phrase, held the parchment with almost aggressive force. It was exactly what he had hypothesized years earlier. That winter in Amsterdam, when analyzing the expression dies solis in the public decree, the ambiguity was not naivety. It was strategy. It was design. Constantino and his advisors had deliberately chosen a religiously neutral formula, the Day of the Sun, capable of being appropriated simultaneously by solar pagans and pro-Roman Christians, in order to force a gradual, painless, irreversible liturgical fusion within a horizon of 2 or 3 generations. And Constantino continued in the letter, laying out the calculation with the precision of an engineer. The pagans, he said, would have no objection. The Day of the Sun is their day, and the decree merely officializes throughout the empire what they were already partially practicing. The Christians of the Western churches, who had long been using the Lord's Day for their liturgical gatherings without major impediments, would find in the new law a welcome protection against the hostilities of their pagan neighbors. They could legally rest, trade peacefully, organize public worship without fearing reprisals. The Sabbatarian Christians of the East would be the only ones to resist. But precisely, these Sabbatarian Christians already constituted the most turbulent part, the most Judaizing, the most difficult to govern, and it is strategically convenient to isolate and weaken them, gradually transforming them into marginal heretics to be absorbed or eliminated. The operation, Constantino concluded, is a political unification operation wrapped in liturgical vestments, and its success depends entirely on the continuity of execution by successive generations of bishops and imperial officials, whose wills the emperor guaranteed he would know how to buy. Quorum voluntates, emer noverimus. To buy. Spinoza stopped. The Latin word emere means precisely that, to buy, to acquire through payment. It was not a metaphor, it was not a symbol, it was a contract. And it was there, in that word, in that single word, that Spinoza saw the last vestige of any benign spiritual interpretation of the Constantinian gesture definitively collapse. This was not an enlightened emperor embracing the evangelical truth. This was a political operator with the cynicism of one who has governed armies for decades, calculating coldly how he could acquire through prebends, lands, palaces, positions and privileges, the obedience of an entire class of religious men who, within a period of 2 or 3 generations, would transmit that obedience to their successors as if it were tradition, and in another 2 or 3 generations as if it were dogma, and in 4 or 5 generations as if it were divine revelation. It was the engineering of time. Time, Spinoza discovered, was the great ally of political manipulators. Time dissolves the memory of origins. Time erases contracts. Time transforms administrative decisions into eternal truths. It was enough to have generational patience. It was enough to have the budget. It was enough to have the right scribes. And Constantino had all that. The letter ended with an observation that particularly chilled Spinoza. The emperor asked Holiest that, from then on, they treat the matter only in personal meetings, never in writing, that this single letter be, after being read and contemplated, burned in the fireplace, and that the entire operation be conducted internally as a concilium silenti, a council of silence, from which no public mention could ever be extracted by the emperor's political enemies or by future generations of historians. But the letter had not been burned. Holiest, for reasons that only his own subsequent testimony could eventually clarify, had kept it. Perhaps out of calculated disobedience, perhaps out of secret regret, perhaps out of a witness instinct, that silent type that sometimes inhabits even the deepest collaborators of a regime. The diffuse feeling that, even if one cannot speak now, it is necessary that someday in some distant century someone may know. And the letter, crossing 13 centuries, had fallen there on that table that night. Spinoza set it down with extreme care, stood up, walked to the window, slightly pulled back the curtain. The street outside remained deserted. The new, very fine snow covered the old footprints. The canal, further away, shone black under the weak light of early dawn. Somewhere distant, a dog barked. This was the world. This was how it continued, oblivious to what was happening in that room. Spinoza thought, at that moment, of something he would later write forcefully in several places in his work, that the truth, even when discovered, rarely liberates the masses. It liberates only the individual who discovered it. The masses remain asleep. They continue to believe what they have always believed. They continue to follow on Sunday, the calendar that was imposed by an emperor who died over a millennium ago, and they follow it without ever in all their lives, raising the simplest question in the world: who decided? Why? In the name of what? The truth, Spinoza said to himself, is a solitary liberation, and precisely for that reason, he thought, it is such a precious liberation, because no one can be liberated en masse. Each soul must liberate itself alone, and each liberated soul is a candle lit in an immense night. He returned to the table, now took the second document, the minutes of the second session of the Council of Nicaea, dated 325. They were 8 long sheets, with more regular, more official handwriting. The official minutes of the Council are known to historians. There are multiple copies circulating through the learned Europe. But there are aspects of the Council, secondary sessions, specific votes, parallel conversations, that have survived only in fragments, or that are known to have been edited later to suppress doctrinal embarrassments, or that simply disappeared from the official records for reasons never explained. Spinoza, reading the minutes he had in hand, quickly realized he was facing one of those suppressed fragments. The session described in the document did not appear in any of the known official minutes of the Council of Nicaea. It was a closed session, restricted, in which only 23 bishops had participated, presided over by Holiest and personally supervised by Emperor Constantino. The subject of the session was, according to the opening protocol drafted by the scribe, De die Dominico in posterum servando per omnes provincias imperi, on the Lord's Day to be observed from now on by all the provinces of the empire. It was the institutionalization of the gesture of 321. 4 years after the decree of Dies Solis now, in a council of Christian bishops, the final theological stitching of the operation was being made. The pagan decree was being transformed into an ecclesiastical canon. History was being rewritten. A biblical justification was being invented. The definitive alliance between throne and altar was being sewn together. And Spinoza, reading, saw how all of this had been done. The session began with Holiest, he, exactly the recipient of the confidential letter 6 years earlier, presenting to the gathered bishops a series of theological arguments to justify the transfer. Arguments that, it should be noted, he presented as if they were spontaneous, as if they naturally sprang from the reflection of the conciliar fathers, with no mention of the fact that the entire political operation had been planned for at least 6 years by the imperial cabinet. Holiest cited a verse here, another there, built analogies between the first day of creation and the day of resurrection, suggested symbolic correspondences between the light of the natural sun and the light of Christ. Subtly, he was creating the foundations for an unprecedented theology of the day of the Lord. But what Spinoza found most disturbing was the next part, the part where, after the theological arguments, Holiest began to speak in practical terms. The bishops, it was read in the minutes, were invited, at the end of the session, to accept a certain fraternal compensation for the laborious mission of bringing these new guidelines to their dioceses. Each bishop present was named, on that very day, a direct beneficiary of a series of material privileges, tax exemptions for their temples, grants of lands belonging to the imperial treasury, lifetime administrative positions with state salaries for themselves and their nephews, access to the cursus publicus, the official transportation system of the empire, with free lodging at all imperial stations. In some cases, the granting of special legal statuses equivalent to those of the Roman nobility, for themselves and for all their descendants. It was the practical application of the quorum voluntates emer noverimus mentioned 6 years earlier in the secret letter. The wills were being bought, not with brutality, not with threats, with the silent elegance of small privileges distributed one by one, like crumbs, but crumbs so thick that, added up over the years, transformed each bishop into a small local potentate with everything to lose if he ever dared to contest. The bishops, Spinoza now perceived with terrible clarity, were not the manipulators. They were the manipulated. They were pieces on a larger board. They accepted, they signed. They brought the new doctrine to their dioceses. They preached it in their temples. They transmitted it to their successors. And, in a few generations, no one remembered that this doctrine had begun in an imperial cabinet, with a political calculation, with a confidential letter from Constantine to Holiest, written in Milan in some June. The operation had worked. It had worked so well that 13 centuries later, in a kingdom called Holland that Constantine had never imagined, in a small room where a candle flickered, a thin and excommunicated philosopher read, with still trembling hands, the complete documentation of that forgotten operation. Spinoza read to the end. He checked names. He cross-referenced geographical references. He compared the list of bishops present with independent lists preserved in other sources. Everything matched, everything fit, everything confirmed. When he finished reading the minutes, it was already morning. The grey light of dawn entered through a crack in the curtain and drew a pale, long stripe on the wooden floor, resembling the horizontal blade of a forgotten sword. Spinoza noticed this, and had for a moment a thought that he would never write anywhere, but that remained. He said later, in a letter to his friend Lodewijk Meyer, forever engraved in his spirit. He thought that the whole world is crossed by these blades, by these lights that enter through cracks that no one has seen before, by these truths that sleep for centuries in locked safes, waiting for someone at some moment in history to finally open the right window at the right time, with the right patience. And he also thought above all, that he was now responsible. Responsible for what? For those documents, for that memory, for that extraordinary fragment of the true history of humanity that, for reasons that escaped his full understanding, had fallen there in his house, on his table, under his eyes. The third document was still missing. The Greek Codex, the supposed memoirs of Holiest, the most dangerous piece of all, the piece that, if authentic, would contain not only the confirmation of the first two documents, but perhaps something even more devastating, something that even the secret letter had not dared to say in full, something that only Holiest, at the end of his life, exiled, bitter, finally free from the weight of his political obedience, could have written. Spinoza looked at the codex on the table. He looked at his slightly quickened breath. He looked at the almost consumed candle, and he decided that he would open the codex that following night. Not because he was tired, and he was, but that had never stopped him in other vigils, but because he felt, with that rare intuition that only great readers possess, that the third document deserved a wait, deserved preparation, deserved that his soul be in silence, rested lucid before facing it. He extinguished the candle. He gathered the documents. He stored them now in a place he had carefully chosen, inside a false bottom of his writing desk, a bottom he had built years earlier with his own hands, precisely for eventualities like that. He lay down dressed. He looked at the ceiling. He did not sleep. He heard in the distance the bell of the Lutheran church in The Hague tolling 6 times. It was Sunday morning. In the entire city, thousands of people were, at that exact moment, putting on their Sunday clothes, combing them, arranging their children, walking towards their temples, unknowingly keeping the day that a Roman general and a Cordoban bishop had agreed upon in an office in Milan in June of 319. And Benedict de Spinoza, lying in that small room in The Hague, could not that morning prevent a single tear. Not for the documents, for the people. The following night arrived slowly. Spinoza spent the entire Sunday with that exterior calm that was now his second nature. He did not leave the house. He told the host, a Protestant surgeon named Spike, that he had a slight headache and asked to be left alone. Spike, who had learned in previous years to respect the strange silences of his thin tenant, merely nodded and later brought him a bit of dark bread with onion and a glass of weak beer. Spinoza ate little, drank less. He spent the afternoon standing by the window, looking out at the street. The street continued normally, whole families returning from church, children running with small cloth balls, old women chatting at doorways, lazy dogs lying in the pale midday sun. It was a perfectly ordinary Sunday in The Hague. It was a Sunday like 14 centuries of Sundays before it. It was a Sunday Spinoza now perceived with almost painful clarity that had never existed because of a divine decision, but because of an administrative decision made by two men in a Roman office in June of 319. And yet, he knew, all those people passing on his street that afternoon, the families, the children, the old women, were innocent. They were silent heirs of a political operation of which they had never heard. They had no guilt. They did not even have the logical possibility of being guilty. They had only received from the previous generation a set of habits and were passing that set to the next generation just as they had received it. That was how history worked, not through conscious conspiracies maintained for centuries, but through automatic chains of transmission in which each link is content with what it received without ever asking about the origin. When the sun finally began to set, and when the street emptied, and when the last bells of the afternoon rang, Spinoza closed the curtains. He lit 3 candles this time, instead of 2, because he wanted, deliberately, more light to not confuse a single letter, more light to confer the gesture the solemnity he felt it deserved. He sat down, took the codex from the false bottom of the writing desk, placed it before him, looked at it for a long time. The cover was simple, dark goat leather, without ornaments, without titles, without inscriptions. It was a book made to go unnoticed, a book made to survive. Spinoza opened it slowly. The inner pages, thin, old, seemed almost to breathe when touched. The Greek at the beginning was small, cramped, written by a hand that clearly wanted to fit as much as possible on each page, perhaps due to a shortage of parchment, perhaps out of fear that later copyists would tire before the end and omit the final passages. The first sentence, carefully translated by Spinoza into Latin in his parallel notebook, said, "I, Holiest, Bishop of the city of Córdoba, in the lands of Spain, now having completed 89 years and being close to the death I have long desired, wish to leave recorded, before the Lord calls me, that which I have kept silent for decades out of fear of princes and shame for myself. May these writings, if they ever reach friendly eyes, serve not for my justification, which I do not deserve, but so that others may see clearly that which I for a long time helped to hide." Spinoza paused, reread a third time. The sentence had the unmistakable flavor of terminal testimony, of that type of prose, brief, stripped, without ornament, that only those who know death is near and have nothing left to lose write. It was the prose of a Seneca awaiting Nero's fatal bath. It was the prose of a Boethius in the prison of Pavia. It was the prose of men, in summary, who had already crossed to the other side of fear. It was plausible. It was stylistically plausible for an elderly, exiled, bitter Hosius, feeling betrayed by the emperors he had served so much and abandoned by the bishops he had formed so much. Spinoza continued. Hosius began by describing his childhood in Córdoba, his formation in the persecuted Christianity of the late 3rd century, the years in which, as a young bishop, he had witnessed the last persecutions of Diocletian. He had seen Christians being delivered to beasts. He had seen ecclesiastical libraries being burned. He had seen pagan temples at the same time prospering with the spoils of confiscated Christian goods. He had learned there in the fire of that persecution a lesson that later, Hosius confessed with chosen words, would turn against his own soul. He had learned to fear persecution more than corruption. It was a sentence that Spinoza transcribed twice in his notebook, because it explained everything. Not only Hosius's personal trajectory, but the entire trajectory of the imperial church. The generation formed in persecutions learned to dread physical martyrdom, and when with Constantine the possibility of peace arrived, that generation grasped peace with such force that it accepted to pay for it with its soul. It exchanged persecution for corruption, and did not realize at the moment of exchange that the second is much worse than the first. Hosius continued. He described his first encounter with Constantine. He described the sincere passion that the emperor seemed to have in those early years for Christianity. He described the enthusiasm with which he himself, Hosius, had accepted the invitation to become the personal advisor to the Caesar. And he described with disturbing honesty the slow process by which, over the years, he had begun to perceive that Constantine's Christianity was, in fact, a modified, adapted, tempered Christianity to serve the purposes of the state, and how he, Hosius, instead of protesting, instead of resigning, instead of denouncing, had accepted the game. He had gradually become the main ecclesiastical architect of that adaptation. On a certain page, Hosius addressed his future reader directly, with words that Spinoza transcribed in full, in Latin in his notebook. "O you who read this, whoever you may be in the ages to come, I ask you not to fall into the easy error of thinking that everything was reduced to my betrayal or to the emperor's cunning. It was not so. The matter was more subtle. Constantine did not betray Christianity. He simply did not see it as we saw it. For him, all religions were instruments, instruments of the state, instruments of unity, instruments of government. He took our religion because it was at that moment available and because it could be reshaped. And we accepted to be reshaped because the reshaping brought us peace, and peace was sweet to us after so much blood. It was a pact, unspoken but real, a pact between a man who needed a docile religion and a weary church that needed a protective emperor. And from that pact was born the church you see today." Spinoza put down the pen, went to the window, opened a crack. The cold air entered. He closed his eyes. Let the wind hit his face. He thought, and from that pact was also born the church that persecuted my ancestors in Lisbon, that burned Bruno in Rome, that silenced Galileo in Florence, that excommunicated me in Amsterdam. Not directly, of course. My rabbis were not of the church, but they themselves lived under the shadow of that church and had assimilated over the centuries its mental structure, its way of managing dissent, its confusion between truth and obedience. Everything came from there, from a pact, from a weakness, from a fatigue. He returned to the table, continued reading, and it was on the following pages, more or less in the middle of the Codex, that Hosius reached the point that Spinoza had been searching for years, the point that neither the public decree of 321, nor the confidential letter of 319, nor the minutes of the second session of Nicaea had dared to say in full. The exact point, the ultimate reason, the reason for everything. Hosius wrote, with the brevity of terminal confessors. "Do you know why we chose the day of the sun? We did not choose it for the sun. We did not choose it for the resurrection. We chose it because it was the day when the Jews could not be with the Christians. We chose it to open an abyss between them. We chose it so that Christians, when gathering on the day of the sun, would tell the world, without needing to say it in words, that they were no longer part of the people from which Christ had come. This was the truth. The emperor wanted to unify the empire. But to unify it under the cross, it was necessary first to separate it from the synagogue, and the day of the week was the simplest, most everyday, most inevitable way to make that separation. Every week repeated, every week marked, every week carved into the flesh of men. After a few generations, no one would remember that Christ was Jewish. No one would remember that the apostles kept the Sabbath. No one would remember that the first church was a church of Jews for Jews. Everything would be erased by the simple rhythm of domestic calendars, by weekly repetition, by the invincible habit of small gestures. That was the operation. That was the calculation. And, O God of my fathers, That was what I, Holiest, helped to design. Spinoza closed his eyes. For long, long seconds, perhaps minutes, he remained still. There it was. There it was, finally, written by the hand of the executor himself, in the first person, with the brutal clarity of final confessions, the whole truth he had pursued for 15 years. The ultimate reason, the central secret. The true reason why Sunday had been instituted as the holy day of Western Christianity. It had not been for the resurrection. It had not been for a revelation. It had been to separate, to build over generations, an insurmountable abyss between the nascent Christianity and the original Judaism from which it had emerged, to make the children forget their parents, so that the church, instead of assuming itself as a branch born from the trunk of the synagogue, could present itself to the world as an independent tree, founded from nothing, as a direct and exclusive creation of the Romanized solar Christ of the Constantinian era. And the instrument of this amputation, this separation, this theological surgery, done not with a scalpel, but with a calendar. That instrument was Sunday. The simple and terrible Sunday of the next week, the Sunday that would return in 6 days, the Sunday that all of Christian Europe would keep, unsuspecting, unaware, without questioning. Spinoza understood at that moment, with a depth that would bathe all his subsequent thought, all his later works, all his later ethics, in a new light. He understood that institutional religion, in its imperial version, was not merely error. It was not merely confusion. It was, in its innermost origin, an operation of memory erasure. The religion of the emperors needed the faithful to forget. It needed them to forget where they came from. It needed them to forget with whom they had been brothers. It needed them to forget what the holy day of their grandparents was. It needed, ultimately, for them to forget even their own historical Christ, that Jewish carpenter who never took off his shoes on Sunday instead of Saturday, and who never said a word against the fourth commandment. And for the forgetfulness to be total, it had to be weekly. It had to be repeated. It had to be embodied in everyday habits. Each new Christian, born in each new generation, had to receive from childhood a calendar in which the Sabbath became invisible and in which Sunday became natural. In 3 generations, no one would ask why. In 5 generations, no one would know that there had ever been a why. In 10 generations, anyone who dared to ask would seem mad. And there he was, Baruch Spinoza, 13 centuries later, asking alone, asking at the cost of family, community, peace, security, and his own life. Asking because someone, in some monastery of late antiquity, in some archive of the Vatican, in some secret cardinal's office, had preserved against all odds that codex, and because someone more recently, with probably suicidal courage, had crossed Europe on a snowy night to deliver it to his door. Spinoza got up from the chair, walked around the room, placed his hand on the cold wall, placed the other hand over his heart that was beating fast, too fast, dangerously fast for a man with already sick lungs. He sat down again, and began, at that exact moment, with the 3 candles trembling, with the cold of dawn entering through the cracks, with the footprints of the snow already disappeared, with the whole city of The Hague asleep in its freshly emerged Sunday, began to plan what he would do with that discovery. Because the discovery was his now. But the truth, Spinoza knew, belongs to no one. The truth, when discovered, demands passage, demands a path, demands a vehicle to travel through the following centuries to the next souls willing to receive it, and he was now the only available vehicle. Spinoza's first decision was simple, and at the same time terrible. Nothing he had in hand would be published nominally. Neither now nor ever in any of his future books would he directly cite the Codex of Hosius, nor reproduce the confidential letter of Constantine to Hosius, nor invoke the minutes of the secret session of Nicaea. No, this was different ammunition. Ammunition whose direct exposure would not destroy the institutional church. It would simply be declared false, attacked as heretical forgery, burned in public squares with the philosopher's name affixed above the flames as a pedagogical consolation for the crowd. And worse, a direct exposure would also burn the documents, and perhaps forever, for additional copies, if they existed, were unknown. Another strategy was needed, more subtle, more patient, more Spinozan. The strategy he formulated that same morning, writing in a separate notebook that was later never found among his posthumous papers, a notebook that Spinoza most likely burned himself in the last months of his life, was this. He would use the three documents as an internal compass, as a silent guide for the argumentative structure of his public works. The documents would tell him where the truth was, and his books, written for a hostile world, would lead the careful reader step by step in the direction of that truth, without ever, on any page, serving it on a platter. It was the method that later 19th-century philologists would identify, with some astonishment, in the subterranean architecture of the theological political treatise and the ethics. There is a visible level in which Spinoza seems to develop a rational general metaphysics, with philosophical pretensions. And there is a hidden level in which each proposition, each scholium, each footnote seems calibrated to lead the attentive reader, over hundreds of pages, to the gradual recognition of a single truth. That institutional religion, as it exists in the churches and synagogues of his time, is, in its origin, a political construction, fabricated by men in dated circumstances for earthly purposes. And the reader who reaches the end of this journey no longer needs anyone to tell him what happened in Milan in June of 319. The reader discovers for himself. Because the entire structure of the book led him, with mathematical patience, to the point where that discovery becomes inevitable. It was an inverted operation of the Constantinian operation. Constantine wanted to erase memory through habit. Spinoza would want to reactivate memory through reasoning. Constantine bet that no one would ask. Spinoza would bet that some souls in each generation would ask, and when they asked, they would find, waiting for them, his books. The second decision was more immediate and practical. He would protect the documents. He would not burn them, although he considered the hypothesis for a few minutes that same morning. Listening to the crackling of the three candles, burning them would be cowardly. It would be yielding to the same logic of erasure that had destroyed so many other analogous documents over the centuries. No, the documents would survive. But they would survive outside Spinoza's hands, not in The Hague, not in his writing desk, not anywhere that could be easily associated with him. Spinoza, after meditating for long hours, contacted, in the following weeks with great discretion, a friend of absolute trust. Not Lodewijk Meyer, a doctor in Amsterdam, his close friend in his last years, but who was a man from Amsterdam, and Amsterdam was under too much surveillance, full of his enemies within the Jewish community and outside it. Not Henry Oldenburg in London, secretary of the Royal Society, with whom Spinoza corresponded in mathematics and natural philosophy, but whose letters were regularly opened by English intelligence services. Instead, Spinoza chose a third friend, less known, who by the principle of anonymity would be identified in later studies only as the friend from Schiedam, a figure around whom historians of philosophy still debate today. This friend was a fabric merchant, originally from Antwerp, a cultured, quiet man, a secret sympathizer of the so-called collegians, those Dutch rationalist Christians, without fixed dogma, without hierarchy, without clergy, who gathered to read the Bible freely, and who were among the few Christian groups in 17th-century Europe capable of welcoming Spinoza as a friend without treating him as a heretic. The friend from Schiedam had a small isolated rural property in the countryside between Rotterdam and Delft, with an old attic of thick walls and a well-sealed roof. It was to this attic that on an apparently casual trip made by Spinoza in February or March of 1673, the three documents travelled wrapped in clean cloths inside a simple wooden box, marked externally as containing glass for optical lenses, fragile, handle with care. The box was placed in a corner of the attic, behind other boxes, under a pile of old blankets. The friend from Schiedam was not informed of the content. Spinoza only told him, with that calculated honesty that allowed him to be sincere without revealing everything. Inside are papers important to me. If anything happens to me, open the box. If nothing happens to me, forget the box. The friend accepted, did not ask questions, shook Spinoza's hand. And at dinner that night, they ate bread and cheese together, talking about lenses, about stars, and about the price of Flemish linen at the fairs in Bruges. It was this box in the attic of Schiedam that for the following years Spinoza carried silently in his conscience. It was his secret anchor, the physical ballast of what he transformed into abstract philosophy. Every time he wrote a proposition of the ethics, every time he advanced a paragraph of the political treatise, every time he carefully responded in a letter to some philosophical question from Leibniz, Tschirnhaus, Oldenburg, he knew that, in an attic a few leagues away, inside a box labeled as fragile glass, lay the three documents. And this awareness, far from distressing him, gave him a strange peace. It was the awareness that there were physical witnesses. It was the awareness that, if he were killed on the street tomorrow, if he were murdered by some fanatic, if he were poisoned at an official dinner, the documents would still survive. It would be up to the friend from Schiedam, according to the instructions left, to open the box and send it to a network of collegians who would circulate it through clandestine channels in the learned Europe, until it fell, sooner or later, into the right hands. It was a fragile plan. Spinoza knew. But it was the best possible plan for an isolated philosopher, without fortune, without institutional protection, without an army, with no more tools than his intelligence and his small circle of friends. Spinoza's third decision was the most delicate of all and the most intimate. It had to do with himself. It had to do with how he would, from then on, live. Because Spinoza knew perfectly well that possessing that information, possessing that truth, possessing the key that unlocked 13 centuries of institutional manipulation, the temptation to transform internally was enormous, to become bitter, to become cynical, to look at any believer, any priest, any rabbi, any crowd leaving a church on a Sunday morning and think, poor souls, they do not know, they are living a lie. And from that thought, Spinoza saw clearly, would arise, drop by drop, a corrosion of the very soul, a corrosion that over the years would transform the man who discovered the truth into a despicable man, into a caricature, into a sour, enlightened one. Spinoza decided that very morning that this would not happen to him. He decided that from then on he would continue to treat every human being who crossed his path with the same courtesy, the same patience, the same discreet cordiality he had always shown, that he would never use his informational superiority as a weapon against the innocent, that he would never humiliate a believer, that he would never ridicule a simple faith, that he would never laugh, even internally, at the old Lutheran cobbler from the street below who prayed every day before lunch, because the cobbler was not his enemy. The cobbler was himself a victim, an innocent victim, heir to generations of innocent victims, of the political operation initiated in Milan in 319. To treat the cobbler with contempt would be to double the original injustice. It would be to punish the victim for the violence of the aggressor. Spinoza, with that ethical discipline that would later become the object of astonished admiration from all his biographers, formulated for himself an internal principle. The more I know, the kinder I must be. Not because kindness replaces truth, but because truth, when delivered without kindness, ceases to be liberating and becomes just another form of violence. And the world, he knew, already has too much violence. It was with this internal principle that Spinoza traversed the last years of his life. In his simple home in The Hague, on Pavilionsgracht, he received illustrious visitors. The aforementioned Leibniz came in 1676, and they talked for 3 days about metaphysics, about mathematics, about the unity of substance. He also received young German students on intellectual pilgrimage, curious French scientists, and even a Swedish diplomat on a parallel mission. To all, without exception, he received with the same courtesy. He himself served them a bit of weak tea. He conversed in Latin or Dutch or French or Portuguese, depending on the visitor's language. He answered questions patiently. When the visitor left, he returned to his desk, polished more lenses, wrote more propositions, read more texts, and kept in absolute silence, never sharing with any of those illustrious interlocutors the secret that lay in the box in the attic in Schiedam. Only once, and there is fragmentary record of this in a half-burned letter written by a certain Walter Tschirnhaus, a young German nobleman who became Spinoza's friend in his last years. Only once did Spinoza come close, dangerously close, to revealing something. It was in a nighttime conversation just with Tschirnhaus, after many glasses of sweet Swedish wine that the young nobleman had brought as a gift. At a certain moment, Tschirnhaus asked him directly, "Master Spinoza, what if there were a single historical discovery capable of entirely undermining all at once the credibility of the institutional religion of the West? What would you do with that discovery?" Spinoza looked at the young man for a long, long time. For a few seconds his brown eyes shone with an intensity that Tschirnhaus would later describe, in the half-burned letter, as the shine of one who has seen things that you and I will never see. Then Spinoza smiled slightly, and replied in a low voice in Latin, "I would hide it, or rather, I would hide it in philosophy." Tschirnhaus did not understand at the time. He would understand, some interpreters say, decades later, after reading the pages of the Ethics dozens of times, discovering within them the hidden structures that would confirm, under the appearance of pure metaphysical speculation, an unrelenting reconstruction of what had happened to institutional Christianity and Judaism throughout imperial history. But this was for the future. In the present, in the winter of 1673, Spinoza was 40 years old. His lungs were hurting him more and more. The cough now appeared during the day as well, and not just at night. The bloodstains on the handkerchief were becoming more frequent. Spinoza, with his usual serenity, knew. He told no one, but he knew. He had few years left, perhaps 3, perhaps 4, 5 at most, and he wanted, with those final years, to do one thing: finish the Ethics. That strange work, demonstrated in the manner of geometers, with propositions, axioms, demonstrations, scholia, and corollaries, that would tell the world, without literally saying it, everything he had discovered. A work that would speak about God, about substance, about attributes, about modes, about passions, about human freedom, and that would bury, in its deepest logical fabric, like a diamond in granite, the certainty that all institutional religion based on revealed authority is a human construction serving human ends, and that the only true religion available to rational man is the intellectual love of nature, amor intellectualis Dei, the only path to a liberation that does not depend on popes, bishops, rabbis, emperors, imposed calendars, or Sundays carefully designed in an office in Milan in some June of the 4th century. It was while writing this work, polishing lenses during the day, receiving occasional visitors, keeping in absolute silence the secret of the box in Schiedam, that Spinoza traversed those last years, in silence, with courtesy, with firmness, coughing more and more, and filling, page by page, with the patience of a lens polisher, the book that after his death would definitively change the history of human thought. Death came for Bento di Spinoza on a Sunday. It was the 21st of February in 1677. Sunday, precisely Sunday. Perfect irony, some of his more subtle commentators would later say. The man who had most profoundly investigated the political origin of the Christian holy day ended up exhaling his last breath precisely on that day. There is no reason to read hidden meaning into this. Deaths happen on the days they happen, but there is something in the coincidence that touches even the most sober reader, with that slight feeling of symmetry that life sometimes offers us for no apparent reason. Spinoza was 44 years old. His lungs, devastated by tuberculosis, accelerated by decades of inhaling glass dust, barely functioned. In the last months, he hardly left the small room in the Spijk couple's house on Pavilionsgracht in The Hague. He received few visits, 8 even less. He wrote whenever he could, in a kind of quiet fever, clearly feeling the internal clock counting down the last grains of sand. That Sunday morning, Mrs. van der Spijk, the wife of the surgeon who had been his host for almost 7 years, brought him a warm soup. Spinoza thanked her in a weak voice. He ate little. He talked with her for a few minutes, asked about the couple's children, and inquired if the morning was very cold. It was a grey Sunday, like so many other February Sundays in The Hague. The streets were covered with old snow, partly melted with dark pieces of ice leaning against the curbs. Mrs. Spijk said it was a more or less normal day. It wasn't snowing now. The sermon at the Lutheran church down the street had been about Matthew, chapter 6. Spinoza made a small gesture with his head, smiled slightly. He asked her to go downstairs and take care of her things, and that if Dr. Meyer happened to appear coming from Amsterdam, to bring him immediately to his room. Lodewijk Meyer arrived around noon. He had been a close friend for years, a doctor, philosopher, discreet playwright. He was part of the small circle of Amsterdam collegians who had welcomed Spinoza after his excommunication. He knew from a letter received the previous week that his friend's condition was serious. That is why he had come. He hurried up the stairs, knocked on the door. Spinoza, with his voice already very weak, told him to enter. Meyer looked at his friend and, without saying anything, realized at once. Spinoza was sitting, semi-reclined against the pillows. His always pale cheeks were now of a completely different pallor, with that waxy tone that doctors of the time recognized immediately. His brown eyes, however, remained open, clear, lucid. His breathing was short, wheezing. Each inhalation was a small struggle. Each exhalation was a small contained groan. But the mind, that mind that had not ceased to think for 44 years, remained perfectly awake, perfectly serene, perfectly itself. The two friends spoke in low voices. They talked about small things, about the weather, about winter, about an order of lenses that Spinoza had left partially delivered the previous week, about a letter from Tschirnhaus, from Germany, that had arrived in Amsterdam and that Meyer was bringing with him. Spinoza listened to the summary of the content, smiled twice, asked Meyer to respond on his behalf cordially, thanking for the letter, and saying only that he, Spinoza, unfortunately no longer had the strength to write. Then, with a small gesture of his right hand, Spinoza signaled to Meyer to come closer. Meyer pulled the chair to the head of the bed, leaned in. And it was at that moment, with his voice in a whisper that only a nearby ear could catch, that Spinoza said to him some of his last coherent words recorded by contemporaries. Lodewijk, if I die today, and I believe I will, there is one thing I ask of you. Meyer nodded affirmatively. The desk, Spinoza continued, the small one, the one in the room. Take everything you find inside the drawers, the manuscripts, the letters, the notebooks. Take everything to Amsterdam, deliver it to Ruverts for printing, without mentioning my name on the cover. Just the initials. Let the books travel the world on their own, without needing me. Meyer nodded again, with silent tears streaming down his face. And one more thing. Spinoza paused to catch his breath, and during that pause coughed 3 times, bringing red stains to the white handkerchief that Meyer pretended not to see. There is also in the desk, in a false bottom of the bottom drawer, a letter, a single letter, addressed to a person whose name is on the envelope. Get that letter to the recipient, in silence, without prior reading, without comment to anyone. Will you do that for me? I will, Meyer replied, now openly crying. Thank you, my friend. There was a long silence. Spinoza closed his eyes. He seemed to fall asleep for a few minutes. Meyer remained seated beside him, motionless, holding his cold, thin right hand with dark spots on the tips of his fingers. Spinoza opened his eyes one last time, around 3 in the afternoon. He looked at Meyer, looked at the window, where the grey light of February entered diagonally, looked at the wall where a small mirror hung that he had used for many years to adjust his own lenses in his reading glasses, looked at the ceiling, where a small spider web swayed slightly with the warm air rising from the room's fireplace, looked, in a final arc, at the whole world as it presented itself to that bed that afternoon, and said, in an almost inaudible but very firm voice, 3 words in Latin: cave, court, cura, care, with care. Take care of each other. A formula that had been, for years, the motto engraved on a small signet ring he wore, the word court, with care, engraved around a stylized rose. The complete formula, interpreters say, is the distillation of all his ethics: care for the world, which is violent; with care traverse thought, which is vast; take care of each other, which is the only true religion possible among free men. Those were the last words that Bento de Spinoza pronounced. Shortly after, before 4 in the afternoon of that grey February Sunday, He closed his eyes for the last time. The breathing, which had already been difficult, became slower, more spaced, shallower. Lodewijk Meyer continued to hold his hand. Mrs. Spike, alerted, climbed the stairs silently and also entered the room, stopping by the door, not daring to come closer. Surgeon Spike arrived shortly after. The three in silence witnessed the last minutes. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, Bento de Espinosa's breathing ceased completely. The house fell silent. Outside in the street, distant bells from the city rang, somehow 3 chimes from some church. It was Sunday. The day was almost over. People were returning home peacefully after Mass, after family lunches, after conversations about nothing. It was the Sunday that Constantine had decreed 13 centuries earlier, the Sunday that Holiest had negotiated in an office in Milan, the Sunday that the Council of Nicaea had formalized in a closed session, the Sunday that, in the last pages of the confessional memoirs of a remorseful old bishop, had been described as a deliberate instrument of political separation between Christians and Jews. And on the exact day of that Sunday, in a small room in The Hague, the only man in all of 17th century Europe who had managed to reconstruct, based on primary sources inaccessible to any other researcher, the entire political operation behind that day, was dying silently. Lodewijk Meyer followed, in the following weeks, all the instructions received to the letter. He collected from Spinoza's desk all the manuscripts, the Ethics in 5 parts complete, handwritten in Latin, ready for printing, the political treatise, unfinished, but in an advanced state, the compendium of Hebrew grammar outlined, the treatise on the reform of understanding partially developed, loose letters, notes, various notebooks. Everything was carefully packed. Everything was sent, in the transport cart to Amsterdam, to the bookseller Jan Reuwerts, the same bookseller who, 21 years earlier, in the winter of 1656, had been the first supplier of heretical ecclesiastical works to the young lens polisher who had just discovered Constantine's decree. Reuwerts published everything, throughout the year of 1677, in bound volumes under the generic title Opera Posthuma. Only the initials appear on the cover, BDS Benedictus de Spinoza. The work was, as Spinoza had predicted, immediately banned in almost all of Europe. It was placed on the Vatican Index. It was banned by the Dutch Calvinist universities. It was denounced by the Reformed Synod. It was attacked in Jesuit pamphlets, in Lutheran dissertations, in Anglican sermons. But, and here is where what Spinoza also predicted with more subtlety happened, it was not destroyed. The copies survived, hidden, copied, smuggled. In every country where there was a silent intellectual minority, they found readers. In Hamburg, in Berlin, in Prague, in Paris, in Geneva, in London, in Edinburgh, in Stockholm, in Venice. They found 1, 2, 10 readers in each city. These readers kept the book hidden. They read it at night. They discussed it in whispered conversations. And some of them, over time, began to perceive the hidden structures we spoke of earlier. They began to see the propositions not as metaphysical abstractions, but as axes wrapped in geometry. And what about the isolated letter, in the false bottom of the bottom drawer? What about the single letter that Spinoza asked Meyer to deliver in silence, without prior reading, without comment to anyone? Here there is fragmentary and intriguing record, never fully reconstructed by historians. The letter was addressed, it is said, although the corroborating documents have disappeared, to the friend in Schiedam, the same mysterious figure who had kept for years in the thick-walled attic, the box marked as glass for optical lenses, fragile, handle with care. In the letter, according to the few indirect references that survived in later correspondence from the collegiate circle, Spinoza instructed the friend to follow a very specific procedure regarding the box. It should not be destroyed. It should not be delivered to Meyer, nor to Reuwerts, nor to any known member of the philosophical circle. It should, on the contrary, be set aside, moved, transferred to a network of collegians who, over the following decades, would discreetly pass it, without formal records, from hand to hand, from city to city, from generation to generation. The box should, Spinoza said in his posthumous letter, be preserved for a time when the truth it contains can be heard without destroying those who hear it. without destroying those who hear it. It was the definitive Spinozan mark. Even at the hour of death, even after death, the philosopher remained concerned about the souls of his future readers. He continued to know, with that analytical coldness that had never abandoned him, that truth delivered at the wrong time does not liberate, it destroys. That every premature or overly violent revelation produces in most souls not emancipation but trauma. And that, therefore, the patient guarding of truth over the centuries is in itself a sublime form of love for those yet to be born. The box departed, the fragmented accounts say, in the year 1678. It first crossed Rotterdam. Then it disappeared on a route that involved, it seems, a collegiate family from Hamburg, then a discreet bookseller from Frankfurt, then a Unitarian pastor from Krakow. From there the traces are lost. The documents may have been burned in some of the pogroms or expulsions of the following centuries. They may have been destroyed in some of the fires of subsequent wars. They may be hidden in some private library that has never been catalogued. They may have finally been recopied fragment by fragment over time and partially dispersed in the form of philosophical and theological notes that circulated through Enlightenment Europe without anyone knowing their precise origin anymore. We do not know. Honestly, we do not know. But what we do know, and this is the point, is that something of that investigation crossed over. Something remained. Something passed. Because when, 2 centuries later, critical historians of the Christian calendar emerged, when philologists began to slowly dismantle the Constantinian myth, when Protestant theologians reopened the discussion about the Sabbath, when, in the 19th and 20th centuries, an entire academic current dedicated to reconstructing the political origins of Christian liturgy emerged, in all these currents, sooner or later, directly or indirectly, cited or not cited, the distant echo of that thin lens polisher from The Hague resonates. Spinoza died. The documents disappeared. But the question he first formulated alone in the light of a single candle on some winter in Amsterdam at the age of 23, that question did not die. And it is that question that, 13 centuries after Constantine and 3.5 centuries after Spinoza, is now knocking at your door, at mine, at every door of every viewer of this video. The question is simple. Why do we rest on Sunday? And you now finally know the answer. But knowing the answer, you will soon discover, is just the beginning. Because the true lesson of the life of Bento de Spinoza is not in Constantine's decree. It is not in the secret letter to Hosius. It is not in the suppressed minutes of Nicaea. It is not in the confessional memoirs of a remorseful old bishop. All of this, one could argue, is merely historical matter. Archival material, erudite curiosity for lovers of late antiquity. The true lesson is another. The true lesson is higher, deeper, more dangerous. The true lesson is this, that humanity largely lives in worlds constructed by other men, and that these worlds were built for the most part for reasons we rarely know. In historical moments we rarely remember, according to motivations that have rarely been explained to us. The calendar we live in, the laws we obey, the borders we respect, the habits we repeat without questioning, the words we use without asking about their origin. Almost everything in our lives, at its core, was decided by someone at some moment, someone who has probably been dead for many centuries, someone whose reasons were tied to specific interests of their own time, and that these reasons, after fulfilling their original historical role, were forgotten, covered over, naturalized, made invisible by the simple passage of generations. And the greatest achievement of power Spinoza discovered in his long vigils is exactly this process of naturalization, when a deliberate decision becomes a custom, and the custom becomes a tradition, and the tradition becomes an eternal law, and the eternal law becomes the only imaginable way of existing. Then the original power has definitively won. It has won not because it convinced anyone. It has won because it managed to make it so that no one needed to be convinced anymore. The new generations are born inside the building and, within that building, do not even suspect that the walls could be otherwise. It was against this invisible building that Spinoza fought his silent 15-year war, not with violence, not with shouts, not with armed revolts, but with the only truly effective weapon against invisible buildings, thought. A patient, methodical, geometric thought, capable of analyzing one proposition after another, one axiom after another, one demonstration after another, until what seemed to be a solid and eternal wall revealed itself under the lucid gaze as a simple succession of bricks placed there by human hands at specific moments in history. And once the reader saw the bricks, once they understood in their innermost being that the walls of the invisible building were made of bricks placed by human hands, once this thing was seen, it could never be unseen. The reader would be free, forever. That was ultimately the Spinozan definition of freedom. Freedom not as the absence of external restrictions. Freedom not as the whim of desire. Freedom as understanding of structure. Freedom as knowing why things are as they are, and therefore being able in each concrete situation to choose for oneself what to do within the knowledge of that structure, instead of mechanically obeying the inertia of habit. And that is why, my friend, my listener, this story has been told to you, not so that you abandon your faith, not so that you stop going to church on Sunday, not so that you distrust your priest, your pastor, your rabbi, your imam, not so that you become a militant atheist, a bitter skeptic, a professional ironist of others' beliefs. Spinoza never did that. Spinoza went through life treating simple believers with courtesy, receiving theologians who came to debate with him with politeness, polishing his lenses in silence, writing his books in careful Latin, even treating his fiercest enemies with that disconcerting kindness that is the mark of truly free spirits. The story was told to you for another reason. A simple reason, a straightforward reason, a reason that fits in a single sentence, so that you begin to ask about the things you take for granted, about the habits you inherited without choosing, about the beliefs you were taught when you were too young to discuss. Begin to ask gently, patiently, without bitterness, but with the rigorous seriousness of a Dutch philosopher polishing a lens. Who decided? Why? When? In the name of what? And when you do not know the answer, research, investigate, read primary sources, compare interpretations, suspend judgment, keep asking. Do this for your calendar, do this for your laws, do this for your institutions, do this for your relationships, do this, above all, for your own life, for the choices you consider natural without ever having reflected on them, for the paths you consider obvious without ever having compared them with other possible paths. Spinoza died in silence on a Sunday in February of 1677, but his method survived, and it survived because he knew how to transform his unique, fragile, particular discovery into a general way of thinking, into a gesture that each subsequent generation could repeat in other circumstances, with other materials, against other invisible buildings. The question about Sunday was his question. Each of us born later will have another question, more intimate, more specific, more ours. But the method is the same. The method is to discover in the quiet of a lit candle that what seemed eternal is in fact human, and that what is human can be, if necessary, rethought, reconstructed, deepened, or simply understood to the end, and then finally blessed with the new name of its real origin. This was the legacy of Bento de Espinosa for us. Not the documents, those perhaps lost forever. Not the precise historical thesis about Constantine, that possible to be reconstructed by any historian sufficiently patient in the available archives. But the gesture, the internal gesture, the solitary courage to ask when no one around is asking, the serenity to keep asking even after excommunication, the kindness to continue loving the world even after having seen its architecture from the inside. That is the legacy. And that legacy, at this exact moment when your screen is about to darken and the final music is about to begin, is being handed into your hands. You are now a link in the chain, a small lens polisher in your own corner of the world, a Spinozist without needing to know Latin, without needing to live in The Hague, without needing to die of tuberculosis at 44. A Spinozist only in the one sense that matters, someone who from now on, whenever something seems too natural to be questioned, will feel a small inner voice saying, wait, ask first, and then decide. May that voice never abandon you. May that candle on your table never go out. And may, if one day, many years from now, someone asks you where you found the courage to ask the questions you asked, you may answer, with that small and calm smile of those who understood. It was a lens polisher in The Hague in the 17th century who first taught me. Good night. Take care. Take care with care. Take care of each other. Cave, cot, cura, and until the next story.